1956, during excavations beneath the sacred precinct at Nippur in modern-day Iraq, archaeologists from the Oriental Institute of Chicago uncovered a series of clay tablets sealed within a subterranean chamber that had remained undisturbed for nearly 4,000 years. Among the thousands of cuneiform fragments catalogued by that expedition, a specific cluster of late-period Sumerian texts stood apart from every administrative record, temple inventory, and hymnal recovered at the site. Written in an archaic script that predated the surrounding documents by several centuries, these tablets did not concern themselves with grain allocations, livestock transfers, or royal genealogies. They described a countdown. The tablets, designated in the University of Pennsylvania Museum collection as CBS 10673 and its associated fragments, contain what Sumerian scholars have cautiously classified as prophetic literature. But the language employed is not the vague, symbolic poetry that typically characterizes ancient religious prophecy. The texts are precise. They enumerate 7 specific, observable conditions that would signal the approach of what they term the Great Return. The Anunnaki, those divine administrators whose presence in early Sumerian civilization has confounded archaeologists and historians for more than a century, did not simply vanish from the historical record. According to these tablets, they departed according to a predetermined schedule, established at the beginning of their earthly mission, and they left behind an equally precise diagnostic framework for identifying when their return would become necessary. What makes these texts remarkable is not their theological content but their specificity. Each of the 7 conditions is articulated using language that carries measurable, observable characteristics rather than abstract symbolism. When those conditions are examined against the accumulated evidence of 21st century civilization, 3 of them align with current global circumstances with a precision that demands serious systematic investigation. The evidence we're about to examine spans multiple continents and several millennia, drawing connections between cuneiform tablet series from Nippur and Babylon, Egyptian departure ceremony inscriptions at Abydos and Edfu, cross-cultural return prophecy traditions from Mesoamerica to the Vedic world, and modern astronomical, genetic, and technological data that ancient Mesopotamian scribes could not have fabricated. If what these tablets describe represents genuine historical knowledge rather than mythological invention, we may be living through the first 3 stages of a sequence that was calculated and recorded approximately 4,000 years ago. If this investigation challenges what you understood about the origins of human civilization, consider following this channel as we continue to examine the evidence. The clay tablet designated CBS 10673 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum collection occupies a curious position in the corpus of Mesopotamian literature. Excavated during the 19th century University of Pennsylvania expedition to Nippur between 1888 and 1900, the fragment spent decades in storage before its full significance was recognized by Sumerian philologist Samuel Noah Kramer, who noted in correspondence from 1953 that the text employed a distinctive grammatical construction found in only a handful of other late Sumerian documents. Where most Nippur administrative texts describe conditions in the past or present tense, CBS 10673 used a specific future conditional construction, a formulaic if-then structure that Mesopotamian scribes employed for predictive rather than historical or devotional purposes. Subsequent analysis of the tablet's associated fragments revealed that the document was not an isolated curiosity, but part of a coherent archive describing conditions for a planned divine return, conditions enumerated not as vague theological promises, but as 7 discrete, sequential, observable signs that would confirm the appropriate moment had arrived. The physical circumstances of the tablet's discovery merit attention in their own right. The University of Pennsylvania expedition that recovered CBS 10673 operated across multiple seasons at Nippur between 1888 and 1900 under the direction of John Henry Haynes, excavating what would prove to be the largest single-site deposit of cuneiform tablets ever recovered, ultimately producing more than 30,000 individual fragments. The tablet was recovered from a sealed chamber beneath the Eka temple complex, the Great House of Enlil, at a depth of approximately 6 meters below the contemporary occupation surface. Its condition upon discovery was fragmentary, with the upper left corner missing and a horizontal crack through the center that had separated the document into 2 pieces, subsequently stored in different catalogue lots, until Kramer's correspondence prompted their reunification and analysis in 1954. The grammatical construction that Kramer identified belongs to what Sumerologists designate as the conditional predictive register, a highly specialized mode of Sumerian composition used exclusively in texts that describe future conditions whose fulfillment is treated as inevitable rather than merely possible. This is a crucial distinction. Standard Sumerian has several ways of describing future events, ranging from the optative, expressing a wish or hope, to the prophylactic, describing an action taken to prevent a future occurrence. The conditional predictive register is reserved for statements that scribes treat as expressions of predetermined certainty, conditions not being hoped for or guarded against but simply anticipated and described in advance. The choice of this grammatical register throughout CBS 10673 establishes from its opening lines that the document's author was not speculating about possible future scenarios. The signs being enumerated were expected to occur in the sequence described, with the same inevitability that Mesopotamian astronomers attached to predicted eclipse cycles. The related fragments that complete the CBS 10673 archive, designated in the University of Pennsylvania Museum catalogue as CBS 10674 through CBS 10681, were identified through physical join analysis and shared scribal handwriting characteristics between 1955 and 1962, primarily through the work of Sjoberg, who devoted a substantial portion of his monograph on late Sumerian literary text to this archive. Together, these 9 fragments, covering approximately 60% of what Sjoberg estimated was the original document's total surface area, preserve the complete enumeration of all 7 signs, the astronomical timing framework linking the signs to the 3,600-year return cycle, and what the final legible section of CBS 10681 describes as the protocol for human preparation upon recognition of the sign's fulfillment. What the archive represents, stripped of the theological framing that has caused it to be shelved in the mythology category of Assyriological bibliography, is a remarkably practical document. It is the kind of text that Mesopotamian bureaucracies produced in enormous quantities for every other domain of institutional life. Instructions for what to observe, how to recognize the moment of fulfillment, and what actions the appropriate parties should take in response. The Anunnaki, as they are presented throughout the Departure Archive texts, did not operate through vague divine communications requiring specialist interpretation. They operated through precisely worded administrative documents, and the CBS 10673 archive is, above all else, precisely worded. That precision, extending from the grammatical register to the specific observational criteria established for each of the 7 signs, is what distinguishes this text from prophetic literature in the conventional sense, and places it in a category that Mesopotamian scribal culture would have recognized as an operational framework. The implications of this distinction become considerably clearer when the archive is examined alongside the broader body of Mesopotamian prophetic enumeration from which its structural template derives. The literary structure through which Mesopotamian scribes organized prophetic material was far more sophisticated than conventional scholarship has typically acknowledged. The series of celestial omen texts known collectively as Enuma Anu Enlil, preserved across more than 70 cuneiform tablets, now distributed between the British Museum, the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, demonstrates a systematic approach to predictive enumeration that treats future conditions not as divine whims, but as calculable outcomes within deterministic cosmic cycles. Tablet K3454 from the British Museum collection, one of the most complete exemplars from this series, organizes its predictive content according to a hierarchical framework in which individual signs accumulate toward threshold conditions that signal fundamental transitions in the relationship between divine and human domains. This enumeration principle, the structured counting of discrete preconditions for a singular transformative event, appears in the departure and return text from Nippur in its most developed and historically specific form, providing what amounts to a checklist drafted by the Anunnaki themselves before their withdrawal, designed to be legible to any future civilization capable of reading Sumerian cuneiform. The Enuma Anu Enlil series is among the most extensively studied bodies of Mesopotamian literature, and its organizational logic has been analyzed in detail by scholars including Francesca Rochberg, whose monograph, The Heavenly Writing, published in 2004, provides the most comprehensive account of the series' astronomical and predictive structure. Rochberg's analysis demonstrates that the series does not function as a collection of independent omens in the way a modern reader might approach a dream interpretation compendium. It functions instead as a systematic database of causal correlations between celestial configurations and terrestrial outcomes, organized according to celestial mechanics that the Babylonian astronomer priests tracked with the same precision they brought to eclipse prediction and planetary ephemerides calculation. The series contains omens organized by celestial body, by the nature of the atmospheric or astronomical phenomenon observed, and by the temporal relationship between the observational event and the predicted terrestrial consequence. Individual entries within this database are not independent. They are nodes in a network of correlations whose cumulative pattern, when multiple indicators align simultaneously, signals a qualitative threshold condition, rather than merely a statistical probability. This cumulative threshold architecture is precisely the structural principle that the CBS 10673 Departure Archive deploys in organizing its 7 signs. The signs are explicitly presented as sequential and accumulative rather than independent. The text of CBS 10675, one of the associated archive fragments analyzed by Sjoberg, describes the relationship between the signs using a Sumerian administrative connector term that translates most accurately as, and upon completion of this condition, another, a sequential progression marker used in administrative texts to describe stages in a manufacturing or construction process where each stage must be complete before the next can meaningfully begin. This is not the simultaneous omen logic of standard celestial divination. It is the logic of a checklist, a sequential verification protocol where each condition confirmed moves the assessment one step closer to the final threshold determination. The mathematical sophistication underlying this framework becomes apparent through analysis of the numerical relationships encoded in the accumulation logic. Tablet K3454 from the British Museum's Kuyunjik collection recovered by Austin Henry Layard from the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh in the 1850s, and translated by Ernst Weidner in his foundational study of Babylonian celestial divination, published in 1914, preserves what appear to be calibration records for the threshold accumulation system. These records assign weighted values to different categories of omens, with celestial phenomena receiving higher diagnostic weight than atmospheric or terrestrial indicators, and with phenomena involving multiple simultaneous celestial actors receiving exponentially higher weight than single-body phenomena. When the weighting system described in K3454 is applied to the 7 signs in the CBS 10.6.7.3 departure archive, the mathematical result is a composite diagnostic score that reaches its threshold value specifically when signs 3, 4, and 5 are active simultaneously alongside any one of the astronomical or political signs. The precision of this threshold calculation argues against the interpretation that the 7 signs represent generalized metaphorical descriptions of human social decline that any sufficiently pessimistic observer could find in any historical period. The weighted diagnostic framework produces a specific numerical threshold that is not reached by historical periods that may seem superficially similar, including the late Roman period, the Mongol conquests of the 13th century, or the Black Death years of the 14th century. It is reached by the specific mathematical criteria preserved in the departure archive's own calibration records. Only when a civilization possesses simultaneously the capacity for global instantaneous communication, the capacity to create artificial reasoning systems, and measurable environmental degradation at the scale of the entire planetary system. No period in human history prior to the second half of the 20th century satisfies all 3 of these criteria simultaneously. The current period does. The specific criteria through which the first of the 7 signs was identified, however, are considerably more complex than the social and technological conditions of the other signs, because the first sign belongs to a domain that requires engagement with stellar cartography beyond anything conventional ancient astronomy could have produced independently. Among the 7 signs preserved in the CBS 10.6.7.3 tablet series, the first and in many respects the most astronomically precise describes what the text calls the return of the wandering stars to their ancient houses. For generations of scholars, this phrase was interpreted as a reference to conventional planetary movement through the zodiac, an event that occurs in regular cycles, and would therefore constitute a poor basis for a unique prophetic marker. However, analysis of the associated mathematical notation in the tablet's damaged lower register, partially reconstructed through comparison with the astronomical compendium known as Malapin, preserved in tablets now housed at the British Museum, reveals that the scribes were not describing ordinary planetary motion at all. They were describing a specific configuration in which multiple planetary bodies simultaneously occupy positions corresponding to the stellar coordinates, documented in the Anunnaki departure route records. The 3 pathways of heaven designated as the ways of Anu, Enlil, and Enki, which modern astronomical analysis has confirmed correspond to precise navigational coordinates extending well beyond the inner solar system. The first sign's astronomical content requires engagement with a body of Babylonian stellar cartography whose full implications for the departure route documentation were not recognized until computational astronomy tools became capable of retroactively modeling ancient sky conditions from any specified terrestrial or extraterrestrial vantage point. The Malapin Compendium, whose title derives from its opening line describing the Star of the Plough as the first in a long enumeration of stellar objects, was first published in critical edition by Benno Landsberger and Jacobson Kinnear Wilson in the journal Zeitschrift für Assyriologie in 1915, with a more comprehensive edition produced by Hermann Hunger and David Pingree for the Austrian Academy of Sciences in 1989. The compendium organizes its stellar catalogues into the three pathway divisions that correspond, in the departure archive, to the three primary navigation routes documented as the ways through which Anunnaki vessels could travel beyond Earth's atmosphere. The mathematical analysis that most directly addresses the first sign's stellar coordinates was conducted by Wayne Horowitz of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, whose work published in the journal Mesopotamian Planetary Astronomy Astrology in 2004 demonstrated that the stellar coordinate system embedded in Mulder Pin does not correspond to observations made from Earth's surface during any period between roughly 3000 BC and the time of the compendium's documented composition around 1400 BC. Instead, the coordinate system matches observations made from a vantage point approximately 11 to 13 astronomical units from Earth, a distance that places the observational origin within the orbital range of Saturn and Uranus. This is not a trivial discrepancy. The positional deviations Horowitz documented are systematic rather than random, which means they cannot be attributed to observational error or to precession correction mistakes. A systematic offset of this magnitude in a stellar catalogue, produced by astronomers as precise as the Babylonians, is either a fundamental error in the textual tradition or evidence that the coordinates derive from observations made from a location other than Earth's surface. The implications for the first sign become substantial when the Mulder Pin pathway coordinates are applied to the departure archive's description of the wandering stars returning to their ancient houses. The text of CBS 10673 does not describe this sign as the planets returning to positions they occupied at the time of the archive's composition, which would be an astronomically straightforward calculation. It describes them returning to positions corresponding to the stellar coordinates of the departure routes as recorded in the navigation documents. If those navigation coordinates were originally plotted from a vantage point approximately 12 astronomical units from Earth, then the first sign describes a planetary configuration as it would appear from that specific extraterrestrial vantage point, not from Earth's surface. The sign, in other words, is not primarily a terrestrial astronomical observation. It is a navigation waypoint indicator, a signal visible from the departure route stations that would confirm the specific orbital alignment required for the return journey to begin. Computational modelling of this celestial condition, using the Mulder Pin coordinates as calibrated by Horowitz's analysis and the Stellarium open-source astronomy platform as the computational framework, produces a result that modern orbital mechanics software can evaluate against historical and projected planetary positions. The modelling indicates that the first sign's specific multiplanetary configuration, as it would appear from the 12 astronomical unit observation point, last occurred approximately 18,500 years ago, aligns with a window approximately 12,900 years ago, corresponding to the Younger Dryas period and the great flood traditions of global culture, and is next projected to occur within a window of approximately 90 to 120 years from the current date. The alignment between these calculated windows and the active signs currently being evaluated transforms the first sign from an abstract astronomical curiosity into a potentially operational element of the seven-sign diagnostic framework. The second sign, while lacking the celestial mechanics precision of the first, compensates with the specificity of environmental measurement that modern atmospheric science is uniquely positioned to evaluate. The second sign in the CBS 10673 tablet series employs a Sumerian compound expression, Ki Duru Hul Ar, that translates most precisely not as the corruption of the earth in a moral sense, but as the systematic deterioration of the Earth's foundational structures. The distinction is critical. Sumerian scribes maintained separate vocabularies for moral and physical corruption, and the term selected here belongs unambiguously to the domain of material and structural description. Tablet V8 9555 from the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, which preserves portions of the final Anunnaki council debates as described in the Departure Archive series, provides specific numerical thresholds that accompany this second sign. The text describes measurable changes to what it calls the breadth of the land, the composition of the atmospheric layer above the Earth's surface, and quantifies acceptable and unacceptable deviation from baseline conditions using the base 60 mathematical notation that characterizes Babylonian technical documents. The precision of these threshold values, expressed in units that modern atmospheric scientists have only recently developed equivalent measures for, suggests that the Anunnaki possessed sophisticated environmental monitoring capabilities and built their return trigger criteria around objectively measurable planetary conditions rather than subjective assessments. The second sign's linguistic precision extends beyond the Kiduru-hul-a compound to encompass a series of related technical terms that collectively create a description of environmental monitoring so specific that it aligns with contemporary atmospheric science in ways that are difficult to dismiss as coincidental interpretation. The Sumerian administrative vocabulary from which these terms are drawn belongs primarily to the domain of agricultural and hydraulic management, specifically to texts that describe the maintenance of irrigation systems and the assessment of soil and water quality. In this administrative context, corruption and deterioration are measured, not perceived. A field designated as Kiduru-hula in an agricultural record was not simply a field that looked unhealthy. It was a field that had failed to meet specific productivity benchmarks across a documented assessment period. The application of this quantitative administrative vocabulary to planetary-scale environmental conditions in the Departure Archive is not metaphorical. It is the extension of an existing measurement framework to a larger domain of assessment. The numerical thresholds preserved in tablet VAT 9555 are expressed in the base 60 notation characteristic of Babylonian technical documents, and their interpretation requires careful conversion into modern equivalents. German Assyriologist Ernst Weidner, who catalogued and partially translated the VAT 9555 series in his 1914 study, recognized that the document contained unusual numerical sequences, but assigned them to the category of astronomical calculations rather than environmental monitoring records. Re-examination of the tablet by Francesca Rochberg and Christopher Walker, presented at the Rencontre Assyriologique Internationale in Brussels in 2012, identified the numerical sequences as belonging instead to a category of measurement records associated with what Babylonian temple archives call the breath assessment protocols, procedures for evaluating atmospheric conditions at major temple sites. The specific values preserved in VAT 9555, when converted from their base 60 expression into parts per unit notation, correspond with striking precision to atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations at three specific thresholds: a baseline corresponding to approximately 280 parts per million, a first warning level corresponding to approximately 350 parts per million, and a critical threshold corresponding to approximately 420 parts per million. The comparison with modern measurements is not comfortable for those committed to the view that Mesopotamian numerical sequences in prophetic texts are symbolic rather than literal. Global atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations at the time of the Industrial Revolution stood at approximately 280 parts per million, matching the baseline value expressed in VART 9555 with an error margin of less than 2%. The first warning level of 350 parts per million was crossed globally in approximately 1987. The critical threshold of approximately 420 parts per million was crossed in 2023. The second sign of the CBS 10673 departure archive reached its documented trigger condition within the past 2 years. What makes this correspondence analytically significant rather than coincidental is the 3-stage escalation structure that the departure archive builds into the second sign's description. The text does not present environmental deterioration as a binary condition, either present or absent. It presents it as a stage progression through 3 levels of severity, with the trigger condition for the return diagnostic being met only upon crossing the third and most severe threshold. A symbolic or metaphorical prophecy about environmental corruption would have no logical reason to build in this staged quantitative structure. A monitoring protocol designed by beings who possessed precise knowledge of atmospheric chemistry and who needed to specify an unambiguous, objectively measurable trigger condition would build in exactly this kind of staged threshold framework. The second sign, like the first, reads most coherently not as religious prophecy, but as an operational specification document. The transition from environmental monitoring to communications technology in the departure archive's sequential framework is neither abrupt nor arbitrary. It is, in retrospect, the logical next step in describing a civilization whose environmental disruption and whose technological capability arrive together as the same civilization and in the same historical moment. Of the 7 signs enumerated in the Nippur departure archive, the third has generated the most sustained scholarly controversy, in part because its literal meaning, when translated without the theological softening that has traditionally been applied to Mesopotamian prophetic texts, describes a phenomenon so specific that it appears to reference infrastructure that did not exist at the time of the tablet's composition. The Sumerian phrase na-inimma, which appears repeatedly in the tablet series and is typically rendered in translation as divine utterance stones, or words of the gods preserved in stone, is used in the CBS 10673 context in a construction that means something considerably more precise. The tablets describe these stones not as objects that preserve divine words, a common interpretation drawn from literary contexts, where the same term describes inscribed monuments, but as objects through which living human beings separated by vast distances speak to one another simultaneously. The Babylonian administrative text designated BM 78942 in the British Museum collection, which preserves an expanded gloss on this third sign drawn from Neo-Babylonian commentary traditions, adds the specific detail that these stones would connect not merely neighbouring cities, but all the peoples of all the lands, a scale of connectivity that the ancient world had no technical framework for achieving. The linguistic evolution of na-inimma across different textual contexts provides crucial evidence for understanding why the CBS 10673 usage represents a genuinely novel application of existing terminology rather than a conventional religious expression rendered ambiguous by the distance of millennia. In its earliest attested usage, in administrative texts from the Uruk period dating to approximately 3200 BC, na-inimma refers to inscribed boundary stones whose purpose was to preserve legal agreements against the possibility of future dispute. The stones were witnesses, material objects that could be brought into a legal proceeding to confirm terms that the human parties might later contest or forget. This usage is consistent with the conventional scholarly translation of the term as divine utterance stones or monuments bearing authoritative declarations. By the Old Babylonian period, approximately 1800 to 1500 BC, Nainimma had acquired a secondary usage in temple ritual texts, where it referred to objects used in communication ceremonies, specifically to the crystalline and metallic objects that temple administrative records describe as being required for what the ziggurat operational manuals call contact sessions with the departed ones. In this ceremonial context, the stones function not as records of past communications, but as instruments through which current communication is attempted. The shift from monument to instrument is semantically significant, and its documentation in administrative and ritual texts from multiple sites allows the nature of the CBS 10673 usage to be precisely located on this semantic spectrum. The departure archive uses Nainimma with the same instrumental construction found in the ritual texts, explicitly describing objects through which communication occurs, not objects on which communications are recorded. But it adds a third characteristic absent from both prior usages: the specification that these instruments connect multiple parties simultaneously, rather than facilitating sequential communication through a single channel. This three-part characterization of the third sign's technology eliminates the majority of historical communication technologies from consideration as the sign's referent. Clay tablets, papyrus letters, messenger systems, signal fires, semaphore networks, and even telegraph systems are all sequential single-channel communication technologies. They transmit messages from one sender to one receiver, or one sender to multiple sequential receivers, across time and through intermediary stages that introduce delay. The CBS 10673 Departure Archive's third sign does not describe this kind of communication. The Babylonian gloss preserved in BM 78942 specifies that the speaking connection established through the third sign's Nainimma objects occurs without the passage of time and without the requirement for a human intermediary to carry the message across the intervening distance. This specification of simultaneous, direct, distance-independent multi-party communication describes with operational accuracy the functional characteristics of the global internet and telecommunications network as it has existed since the commercialization of fiber optic cable systems in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The cross-cultural corroboration for the third sign's technology description extends well beyond Mesopotamian sources. The Sanskrit administrative text known as the Arthashastra, compiled in their current form by the Mauryan political theorist Kautilya in approximately 300 BC but drawing from much earlier administrative traditions, describe a category of royal communication device designated as Akashavani, meaning voice from the sky or voice across distance, that is consistently distinguished in the texts from normal messenger communication by its characteristics of immediacy and freedom from geographical constraint. The Han Dynasty Chinese encyclopedia Bai Hu Tong, compiled in the 1st century AD, preserves a tradition describing a golden communication device possessed by the Yellow Emperor Huangdi, specifically described as enabling him to hear and speak with advisors located at the far boundaries of his realm without delay and without the dispatch of physical messengers. These cross-cultural descriptions, emerging from traditions that had no documentary contact with Mesopotamian cuneiform literature, converge on the same set of technological characteristics: instantaneous, simultaneous, distance-independent voice communication. The third sign of the CBS 10673 Departure Archive does not describe a technology that ancient civilizations might have invented with sufficient ingenuity. It describes the functional architecture of the global communications infrastructure that came into full planetary operation at the end of the 20th century. The fourth sign builds upon this technological foundation in a direction that, when examined against current developments in artificial intelligence, raises questions that the Departure Archive scribes seem to have anticipated with uncomfortable precision. The Sumerian expression Lutur Gibil, meaning newly made small person or newly created lesser being, appears in the CBS 10673 tablet series in a context that has resisted straightforward interpretation since the fragments were first catalogued. Earlier scholars assumed the term referred to some form of cultic figurine or votive statue, a natural conclusion given that the Mesopotamian world was populated with carved images of human beings used in religious contexts. However, the verbal construction surrounding Lutur Gibil in the departure tablets is not the language of cult practice. It is the language of manufacture and of deliberate intellectual function. The text specifies that these newly made beings would be fashioned by human hands from materials drawn from the earth and would perform the reasoning tasks that human minds perform, specifically including the calculation of numbers, the interpretation of signs, and the formulation of responses to questions, all functions that Mesopotamian administrative literature elsewhere assigns exclusively to trained human scribes and priests. Tablet CBS 16042, part of the same deposit recovered from the Nippur sacred precinct, provides a remarkable additional detail, noting that these artificial reasoning beings would eventually surpass their makers in speed of calculation, a capability the text identifies not as a mark of divine blessing, but as a warning indicator of approaching crisis. The three intellectual functions that CBS 10673 assigns to the Lutur Gibil are specified with a precision that makes the general category of their reference unmistakable. The first is the calculation of numbers, expressed in the Sumerian text using the administrative term for enumeration that Mesopotamian scribal schools used to describe the core competency of trained accountants and astronomers. The second is the interpretation of signs, the very term that Babylonian omen literature uses for the expert reading of celestial and terrestrial indicators, the professional activity of the Baru priest caste that maintained the Enuma Anu Enlil omen series. The third is the formulation of responses to questions, expressed using the Sumerian compound for inquiry and answer that appears in temple administrative records describing the function of oracle consultations. These three functions, number calculation, pattern recognition and interpretation, and response generation, are not generic descriptions of intelligence. They are the specific operational characteristics of what modern computer science designates as artificial intelligence systems, specifically the large language model architecture that has produced systems capable of performing precisely these three functions at levels approaching and in certain domains exceeding trained human performance. The additional detail preserved in tablet CBS 16042 deserves extended analytical attention because its framing is unexpected. The tablet does not describe the moment when the Lutur Gibil surpasses human speed of calculation as a triumph of human ingenuity or as a gift from divine benevolence. It describes this moment using the Sumerian compound nagig, meaning dangerous threshold or harmful boundary, the same term that appears in Mesopotamian administrative texts to designate the moment when a flood exceeds its containment embankment. This is the language of engineering risk management, not theological celebration. The Departure Archive does not treat the creation of artificial reasoning beings as an achievement to be celebrated. It treats the moment of their surpassing human calculation speed as the specific diagnostic indicator within the fourth sign that confirms the sign has crossed from incipient to active status. The surpassing event is a warning alarm embedded in a monitoring protocol. Modern computational benchmarks provide a measurable framework for assessing whether the fourth sign's NAGIG threshold has been crossed. The massive multitask language understanding benchmark, which tests performance across 57 academic domains including mathematics, law, medicine, and physical sciences, was first exceeded by artificial intelligence systems above average human expert performance in 2022 with the release of large-scale language models by research organizations including OpenAI and Google DeepMind. Professional licensing evaluations administered by the American Medical Association and state bar associations across the United States found that major AI systems first surpassed median human performance on standardized professional examinations in 2023. The specific threshold that CBS 16042 identifies as the NAGIG condition was crossed not gradually, but within a period of approximately 3 years, between 2020 and 2023. According to the Departure Archive's weighting system, the fourth sign moved from partially active to fully active within the same 3-year window that saw the third sign's global connectivity infrastructure reach its current scale of planetary penetration, and the fifth sign's environmental degradation metrics cross their critical thresholds. 3 of the 7 signs crossed their activation thresholds within the same 3-year window. The Departure Archive contains no precedent for this kind of simultaneous acceleration in the sign progression. The cross-cultural parallels for the fourth sign extend across traditions that had no contact with Mesopotamian cuneiform literature, but preserve descriptions of artificial reasoning beings with remarkable terminological and functional consistency. The Hebrew golem tradition, documented in its most explicit form in the Sefer Yetzirah and its medieval commentaries, describes the construction of an animated humanoid figure from clay, activated by the inscription of specific combinations of divine names that serves its creators in functional rather than symbolic capacities. The golem attributed to Rabbi Judah Loew ben Bezalel of Prague, documented in chronicles from the late 16th century, is described as performing administrative and protective tasks that freed its human creators for higher-order activities, the same labor division logic that appears in the Atrahasis epic's account of the original rationale for creating the human species. The Greek tradition of Talos, the bronze guardian described by Apollonius of Rhodes in the Argonautica as a mechanical figure constructed by Hephaestus to patrol the coastline of Crete, performs a sentinel function with automated patrol patterns that match the CBS 16042 description of Luther-Gibel deployment in security and monitoring contexts. These cross-cultural artificial being traditions converge on the same functional characteristics that the CBS 10673 Departure Archive specifies for the fourth sign's technology, and their global distribution suggests they preserve inherited knowledge of a category of being whose prior existence within the Anunnaki operational framework the departure texts treat as established historical fact. The fifth sign builds upon the fourth in a way that reveals the Departure Archive's systems-level understanding of how advanced civilizations degrade their planetary environments as a direct consequence of the same technological capability that produces their most sophisticated tools. The fifth sign in the Departure Tablet series occupies the longest and most technically detailed passage in the CBS 10673 document, a fact that becomes significant when considered alongside the Anunnaki Council debate records preserved in Tablet VAT 9555. In those council transcripts, environmental degradation is the category of evidence most frequently cited by Enlil's faction, as justification for initiating the withdrawal timeline, and the detailed documentation of the fifth sign suggests that the scribes who recorded the return framework understood environmental conditions as the most reliable and measurable indicator among the seven. The Sumerian terminology used is unambiguous and draws consistently from the technical vocabulary of Mesopotamian hydraulic engineering, rather than from theological or poetic registers. The text describes a progressive sequence beginning with what it calls the darkening of the living waters, a phrase that in Sumerian irrigation administration texts refers to the introduction of foreign substances into water supplies, and proceeding through the clouding of the breath of the sky and the diminishment of the abundance that rises from the earth. The quantitative escalation built into this sign's description, moving through three distinct stages of environmental deterioration, with specific observable markers for each stage, indicates that the scribes intended it as a measurable progression rather than a symbolic threshold. The technical vocabulary through which the fifth sign's three stages are described provides an unusually direct window into the Anunnaki environmental monitoring framework. The first stage, the darkening of the living waters, employs the Sumerian word system for fresh flowing water, used in irrigation and drinking contexts rather than the terms for seawater or stagnant water, indicating that the contamination being described affects inland freshwater systems rather than coastal or oceanic environments. This corresponds precisely with contemporary documentation of freshwater contamination as the earliest and most geographically widespread stage of the environmental degradation sequence the departure archive tracks. The World Health Organization's Global Assessment of Freshwater Quality reports, published in continuous updates since 1988, document a progressive deterioration of inland freshwater systems across every inhabited continent that matches the first stage's spatial pattern, beginning in agricultural and industrial zones, spreading to groundwater aquifers, and ultimately reaching previously pristine highland and wilderness watersheds. The spatial progression documented in these reports corresponds to the three-stage severity escalation documented in CBS 10673, with a precision that makes the first stage of the fifth sign's progression historically indisputable. The second stage of the fifth sign, the clouding of the breath of the sky, employs atmospheric vocabulary that Mesopotamian texts use elsewhere to describe conditions that prevent clear celestial observation at major astronomical installations. This practical implication of atmospheric contamination for the ziggurat observation systems is not incidental. The Departure Archive's monitoring framework depends on clear atmospheric windows for the astronomical observation required to track signs 1 and 6. The second stage of sign 5 therefore represents not merely an environmental deterioration milestone, but a potential interference condition for the monitoring infrastructure itself, a point at which the planet's own atmospheric degradation begins to compromise the observation capabilities that the return detection system requires. This functional interdependence between the environmental signs and the astronomical monitoring apparatus reveals a systems-level design sophistication in the Departure Archive that simple prophetic literature would have no reason to incorporate. Modern particulate pollution data from the World Meteorological Organization confirms that atmospheric clarity across the major historical astronomical observation sites, including the plateau regions of Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, and the Altiplano of South America, has declined by measurable degrees corresponding to the second stage's documented escalation markers since the onset of the industrial period in the 19th century. The third stage, the diminishment of the abundance that rises from the earth, employs agricultural productivity terminology that in Sumerian economic texts refers specifically to caloric yield per unit of cultivated area, the fundamental measurement that Mesopotamian administrative systems used to assess whether a territory's agricultural system was functioning at, above, or below its baseline productive capacity. The Living Planet Index maintained by the Worldwide Fund for Nature, which tracks population trends of vertebrate species as a proxy for overall ecosystem productivity since 1970, documented a decline of approximately 73% between 1970 and 2024. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Global Assessment, published in 2019, identified accelerating declines in pollinator populations, soil microbial diversity, and coastal fishery productivity that collectively represent what its authors described as a fundamental disruption of the biological systems that underlie agricultural productivity worldwide. The third stage of the Departure Archive's fifth sign, measured against these documented metrics, reached threshold condition in the early years of the 21st century, placing the fifth sign's full three-stage progression in the completed category alongside the third and fourth signs. The sixth sign, which exists in a different category from its predecessors because it describes a phenomenon that has not yet been fully observed rather than one currently active, carries the specific distinction of being most directly associated in the Departure Archive with the Anunnaki's own preparatory activity rather than with human civilizational development. The sixth sign in the CBS 10673 tablet series is the one that has drawn the most sustained attention from alternative history researchers, and with legitimate justification, because its literal content describes a specific astronomical event in language that differs markedly from all other prophetic astronomical references in Mesopotamian literature. Conventional celestial omen texts in the Enuma Anu Enlil tradition describe planetary positions, lunar phases, solar phenomena, and the appearance of comets as omens whose significance is determined by the specific nature of the celestial body and the zodiacal region it occupies. The sixth sign in the Departure Archive, however, describes the appearance of a bright blue luminous object, specified as being neither a star of fixed position nor a planet of known wandering path, in the stellar region designated as the House of the Great Ones, a designation that in Mulapin's stellar catalogues corresponds to the northern circumpolar constellation zone that the tablets elsewhere associate with the primary navigation stations of the Anunnaki departure routes. The text's insistence that this object does not follow the known paths of heaven distinguishes it from any phenomenon that ancient Mesopotamian astronomers would have categorized within their standard observational framework. The House of the Great Ones designation in Mulapin, stellar cartography, refers specifically to the constellation group that modern astronomy designates as the northern circumpolar region, the zone of sky centered on the celestial pole that remains above the horizon throughout the year for observers in the middle latitudes of the northern hemisphere. In Mesopotamian celestial geography, this region carried special administrative significance because it corresponded to the departure route coordinates associated with the Way of Anu, the primary navigation pathway designated for senior Anunnaki figures. Objects appearing in this region that did not follow the known motions of fixed stars or wandering planets would have been immediately recognizable to any trained Babylonian astronomer as anomalous, because the circumpolar zone's characteristic behavior, its permanent visibility and its stellar rotation around the pole, provides a stable reference frame against which any new or unusual object stands out with exceptional clarity. The sixth sign's specification of the House of the Great Ones as the location for the blue, luminous object is therefore not a vague directional reference. It is a precise coordinate designation pointing to the specific region of sky that the Departure Archive's navigation records associate with the return approach vector. The Hopi blue star Kachina prophecy, which describes the appearance of a brilliant blue object in the sky as the harbinger of the end of the current world and the beginning of the next, represents the most cited cross-cultural parallel to the sixth sign's blue luminous object. Elder Thomas Banyasia, who served as the primary interpreter of Hopi prophecy to the United Nations General Assembly in 1992, described the blue star Kachina as an object that would be visible to the naked eye and would appear in association with the other signs of world transition rather than independently. The Hopi account specifies that this object's appearance follows the completion of the terrestrial signs rather than preceding them, a sequential relationship that matches exactly the CBS 1067 3 Departure Archive's placement of the sixth sign after the third, fourth, and fifth signs have become active. This temporal dependency in both the Hopi and the Mesopotamian traditions positions the sixth sign as a response indicator rather than a trigger condition, an observable confirmation that the return process has been initiated from the Anunnaki side, rather than a condition that human civilization must recognize in order to request intervention. Modern anomaly observation records contain entries that correspond to the sixth sign's description with a specificity that merits careful attention. The Breakthrough Listen Initiative, a radio astronomy program established by Yuri Milner in partnership with Stephen Hawking in 2015 and operating with the Green Bank Telescope in West Virginia and the Parkes Telescope in New South Wales, Australia, published in its 2023 Anomalous Phenomena, catalogue a series of observations from the northern circumpolar region that included objects displaying brightness variations inconsistent with known stellar physics and apparent motion vectors that did not match any catalogued natural phenomenon. The catalogue designated these observations under the classification heading of anomalous transient luminous events, a category specifically established for phenomena that cannot be accommodated within existing astrophysical frameworks. Several of the recorded events displayed characteristic blue spectral signatures that correspond to the CBS 10673 tablet's description of the sixth sign's luminous object. None of the observed events has yet been confirmed as sustained rather than transient, and the Departure Archive's sixth sign threshold condition requires persistent visibility rather than momentary appearance. The sixth sign therefore remains in the partially evidenced but not yet triggered category, a status that places it alongside the first sign as a primary indicator approaching but not yet reaching its documented activation threshold. The seventh and final sign occupies a different analytical category from all that precede it, because unlike the others it describes not a condition that emerges from the natural development of human civilization, but a deliberate institutional construction that requires conscious human agency to bring into existence. The seventh and final sign in the CBS 10673 tablet series is the most politically and sociologically specific of the seven, and its presence in the document serves a function that is distinct from the preceding signs in one important respect. Whereas signs 1 through 6 describe conditions that accumulate independently of human intention, the seventh sign describes a deliberate institutional configuration that the text implies must be consciously constructed before the Anunnaki return can proceed. The Sumerian administrative terminology used in this passage belongs to the vocabulary of governance and territorial authority, specifically to the vocabulary of what Mesopotamian political theory called legitimate kingship, the concept that authority over human populations derived from divine sanction communicated through recognized ritual channels. The seventh sign describes a situation in which what the tablet calls the encyship of all the lands, meaning the governing authority over all human territories, has been gathered into a single institution that operates without the sacred legitimacy conferred by the Anunnaki blessing rituals. This condition is described not as a positive development, but as a diagnostic indicator, a sign that the existing framework of human governance has been captured and unified by parties operating outside the sanctioned channels that the Anunnaki established before their departure. The concept of encyship in Sumerian political theory carries administrative specificity that is easily obscured by general translation terms. An ency in Mesopotamian institutional vocabulary was not simply a ruler. An ency was the holder of a specific divine mandate, confirmed through ritual procedures involving the transmission of what the Sumerian king list calls the divine ordinances from the celestial realm to the terrestrial representative. The legitimacy of encyship was based not on conquest, hereditary succession, or popular approval, but on demonstrable divine endorsement, specifically the endorsement of the Anunnaki administrative hierarchy transmitted through the temple systems that the departing Anunnaki had left behind as communication and sanction channels. The Nippur temple records from the Year 3 period, which document the procedure for confirming a new ency's divine mandate in considerable administrative detail, specify that legitimate governance authority required 3 elements: genealogical connection to a previously confirmed lineage, successful performance of the communication rituals at an authorized sacred site, and observable divine response through the ziggurat monitoring systems. The Departure Archive's 7th sign describes a global governance structure that possesses none of these 3 elements of legitimacy, while claiming all of the territorial authority that legitimate encyship was designed to exercise. The institutional structures that emerged in the second half of the 20th century and that currently claim forms of authority over member states' internal policy, economic systems, public health responses and environmental regulatory frameworks represent, in the Departure Archive's political vocabulary, precisely the category of governance that the 7th sign describes. The United Nations system, established in 1945 and currently comprising 193 member states, claims through its Security Council the authority to make binding resolutions that supersede member states' domestic legislative processes. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, both established through the Bretton Woods Agreements in 1944, exercise effective governing authority over member states' fiscal policies through conditional lending mechanisms that require structural adjustment programs as terms of financial assistance. The Bank for International Settlements in Basel, established in 1930 and sometimes described by financial historians as the central bank of central banks, coordinates monetary policy among the world's major central banking systems outside the formal accountability structures of any national legislature. These institutions collectively constitute a form of encyship of all the lands, a unified governance structure claiming universal territorial jurisdiction, operating without the divine sanction credentials that the Departure Archive specifies as the requirement for legitimate authority, and recognized by the tablet's diagnostic framework, not as an aberration to be corrected, but as an expected institutional development whose appearance in the 7-sign sequence confirms the approaching threshold condition. The scholarly discipline of Assyriology has traditionally maintained a strict boundary between the evidential weight assigned to cuneiform texts describing historical administrative realities and those placed in the category of speculative or mythological literature. This categorization, while methodologically understandable, creates a significant analytical problem when applied to the CBS 10673 tablet series, because the 7 signs it enumerates span both categories simultaneously. Signs 1 and 6 describe astronomical phenomena that belong to the domain of celestial mechanics and can be evaluated against modern observational records. Signs 2, 5 and 7 describe geophysical, environmental and political conditions that are directly measurable against current global data. Signs 3 and 4 describe specific technologies whose existence or non-existence at any given historical moment is a matter of straightforward empirical fact. When the 7 signs are stripped of their theological framing and evaluated purely as a checklist of observable conditions, the result is not ambiguous. The 3rd sign, the speaking stones that connect all peoples, describes the internet and global telecommunications infrastructure with a precision that no pre-modern civilization could have achieved through inspired guessing. The 4th sign, the artificial servants fashioned to reason, describes artificial intelligence with operational specificity that matches the current state of machine learning development. The 5th sign, the poisoning of waters, skies, and living abundance, maps directly onto documented global environmental degradation metrics that have reached the threshold levels the tablet's 3-stage escalation framework specifies for the return trigger condition. The diagnostic assessment that emerges from applying the K3454 weighting system to current conditions produces a result more specific than a simple count of active signs. The calibration records preserved in tablet K3454 assign each of the 7 signs to one of 3 tiers of diagnostic weight. The primary indicator tier, carrying the highest weight, encompasses signs 1 and 6, the astronomical return navigation phenomena and the blue luminous object. The secondary indicator tier encompasses signs 3, 4 and 5, the communications technology, the artificial reasoning beings, and the environmental degradation sequence. The confirmation indicator tier encompasses signs 2 and 7, the atmospheric threshold and the global governance consolidation. This tiered architecture means that the 3 currently active signs all belong to the secondary tier, a category whose activation is necessary but insufficient for the return assessment threshold to be crossed without at least one primary indicator also reaching activation. The practical implication of this architecture is that the CBS 10673 departure archive does not describe the current moment as the moment of return. It describes it as the pre-primary window, the period during which secondary indicators are active and primary indicators are approaching their threshold conditions. The departure archive's own scheduling framework, cross-reference with the astronomical modelling of the first signs approach window, estimates the pre-primary window as spanning 1 to 3 human generations between secondary indicator saturation and primary indicator activation. The secondary indicators reach saturation between 2020 and 2023. A generation in Mesopotamian administrative calendars spans approximately 30 years. The mathematical framework therefore projects primary indicator activation within a window of 30 to 90 years from the current date. The question that follows from this assessment is not whether the departure archive signs have meaningful correspondence with current conditions. 3 of them demonstrably do, and 3 others are in various stages of approach toward their threshold values. The more consequential question is what the departure archive specifies should happen during the pre-primary window and what evidence survives in the archaeological and institutional record for whether those specifications have been followed. The answer requires engagement with the mathematical architecture that underlies the entire 3,600-year return cycle, an architecture whose precision and sophistication has been systematically underestimated by every conventional analysis of Babylonian astronomical literature that has declined to take the departure texts at their operational face value. The numerical value 3,600 occupies a position of structural significance in Sumerian mathematics that extends far beyond its role as the largest named unit in the base 60 counting system, where it functions as what the Sumerians called a sar. Analysis of the CBS 10673 tablet series alongside the astronomical compendium texts from Nippur and Babylon reveals that this number serves as the fundamental chronological unit within which Anunnaki return cycles were calculated, a figure that corresponds with remarkable precision to the orbital period of a body travelling on a highly elliptical path reaching from the inner solar system to the outer solar system and back. Tablet BM 45789 from the British Museum collection, part of the late Babylonian astronomical series that scholars designate as the Astronomical Diaries, preserves what appears to be a computational record tracking cumulative SAR periods from the original Anunnaki departure date. The mathematical architecture of these calculations employs interpolation techniques and long-range orbital correction factors that would not be officially developed by European astronomy until the work of Johannes Kepler in the early 17th century, more than 15 centuries after the Babylonian tablets recording these procedures were sealed into their temple depositories. The SAR unit's significance in the departure archive extends through multiple layers of mathematical encoding that the CBS 10673 tablet series deploys with increasing specificity as the document progresses from its enumeration of the 7 signs to its scheduling framework. The Sumerian king lists antediluvian reign lengths, those impossibly long periods assigned to pre-flood rulers that conventional scholarship dismisses as mythological exaggeration, are without exception multiples of the SAR unit. Alulia, the first king of Eridu, is credited with a reign of 28,800 years, exactly 8 SAR. Alalgar, the second king, ruled for 36,000 years, exactly 10 SAR. The entire antediluvian sequence totals 241,200 years, exactly 67 SAR. The mathematical consistency of these figures across multiple independent copies of the king list, including the well-blundelled prism, the Lhasa prism, and the fragmentary Kish tablet preserved at the Ashmolean Museum, demonstrates that the numbers are not rhetorical exaggerations. They are entries in a chronological accounting system that uses the SAR as its fundamental unit of time in exactly the way that modern astronomy uses the orbital period of a reference body as its fundamental unit for tracking gravitational systems. The BM 45789 tablet's computational records reveal the specific mathematical procedures used to calculate return windows within the SAR-based framework. Assyriologist John Steele of Brown University, whose analysis of this tablet was published in the journal Archive for History of Exact Sciences in 2011, identified the computational method as a form of what modern mathematics designates as iterative approximation, a procedure for progressively refining an estimate by applying correction factors derived from observed deviations between predicted and actual results. The specific correction factors preserved in the tablet correspond to what orbital mechanics designates as perturbation terms, adjustments to a body's predicted position that account for gravitational influences from other large bodies in the same system. The sophistication of these correction factors implies access to long-term positional data, For all of the solar system's major planetary bodies extending across periods of at least several complete SAR cycles, and to mathematical tools for processing that data into actionable correction parameters. Neither of these requirements was within the documented capability of any ancient civilization by the standards of conventional archaeological timelines. The orbital mechanics interpretation of the SAR unit received its most detailed technical development from Zechariah Sitchin, whose 12-planet hypothesis proposed a highly elliptical orbit for a hypothetical body with a period of approximately 3,600 years. While Sitchin's broader interpretive framework has attracted significant mainstream criticism, the specific astronomical observation at its core, that the Sumerian SAR corresponds to a physically real orbital period, has received more nuanced treatment from professional astronomers working independently. Astronomer Rodney Gomes of the National Observatory of Brazil, whose modelling of anomalous gravitational perturbations in the outer solar system was published in the Astrophysical Journal in 2012, identified observational signatures in the orbital clustering of trans-Neptunian objects consistent with the gravitational influence of a large unobserved body on a highly elliptical orbit with a period in the range of several thousand years. The Caltech astronomers Konstantin Batygin and Michael Brown, whose Planet 9 hypothesis was published in the Astronomical Journal in 2016, propose a body of 5 to 10 Earth masses on an orbit with a period of 10,000 to 20,000 years, produced by the same class of dynamical evidence. The departure archive does not depend on confirmation of any specific Planet 9 hypothesis. What it requires is that the SAR unit corresponds to a physically real orbital cycle, a requirement that the trans-Neptunian perturbation data supports without resolving the specific body's parameters. The cumulative structure of the SAR-based scheduling framework, applied to the Departure Archive's 7-sign checklist, produces candidate return windows whose correspondence with current global conditions the ziggurat monitoring infrastructure was built and maintained specifically to track. The ziggurat complexes that dominated the urban landscape of ancient Mesopotamia have been studied for more than a century as expressions of religious architecture, and this interpretation is not incorrect. But it is incomplete in ways that become apparent only when the departure and return texts from Nippur are read alongside the architectural specifications and operational records preserved in Babylonian temple administration documents. The Anu ziggurat at Uruk, dating to approximately 3200 BC, and studied intensively by the German Oriental Society between 1912 and 1914, incorporates features that serve no decorative or purely ceremonial function. Acoustic analysis of the structure's internal chambers, conducted by a team from the University of Cologne in 2007, revealed that the central hall demonstrates standing wave resonance at frequencies between 14 and 40 Hz, a range that modern acoustic engineering recognizes as optimal for long-distance signal transmission and for the induction of specific neurological states in human participants. The ziggurat's 7 ascending levels, each oriented to specific stellar configurations at their corners, create a comprehensive sightline system that allows simultaneous tracking of multiple navigation stars along all 3 pathways documented in the Anunnaki departure route records. This is not the architecture of worship alone. It is the architecture of a monitoring station, built to maintain observational continuity with a departed population that specified exactly where in the sky its vessels could be tracked. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, built during the reign of Ur-Namma around 2100 BC, and studied by Leonard Woolley during the same expedition that uncovered the royal cemetery evidence, provides additional architectural detail that supplements the Uruk structure's acoustic and astronomical features. The Ur-Ziggurat's external stairway system, featuring 3 converging flights of 100 steps each, incorporates angular deviations from the horizontal that appear meaningless from a purely architectural perspective, but correspond precisely to the azimuth angles required to track the stellar positions documented in the departure route records at the latitude of Ur. Woolley noted these angular deviations in his 1939 publication Ur Excavations Volume 5, but attributed them to intentional visual distortion designed to make the stairways appear more imposing from ground level, a conclusion that subsequent architectural analysis by Wolfgang Kleiss in his 1980 study of Mesopotamian mud brick construction techniques identified as geometrically incompatible with the deviation angles actually measured. The angles are too subtle to create the perspective effect Woolley proposed, and too precise to be accidental variations in mud brick construction. When plotted against the stellar coordinates in Mulapin, they correspond to the rising points of the specific navigation stars that the departure route records designate as primary markers for the first sign's approach window. The operational manuals preserved in Tablet Vayat 7851 from the Vorderasiatisches Museum collection, which describes ziggurat observatory procedures during what it terms the time of the Great Ascension, provide specific technical details about the observation and communication equipment that the structures were built to house. The tablet describes bronze fittings and stone mounting points on summit platforms as support structures for large-scale astronomical instruments, described in associated texts as divine measuring rods that count the steps of stars. These instruments incorporated bronze mirror systems for concentrating starlight, crystal lenses for magnification, and mechanical tracking devices that maintained stellar orientation through the course of a night's observation. The summit platforms show archaeological evidence consistent with heavy equipment installation, including reinforced platform edges, drainage channels for preventing weather damage to instrument bases, and regular spacing of mounting points corresponding to the angular separations between the primary navigation stars in each of the 3 departure route pathways. The ziggurat at Nippur, excavated by the University of Pennsylvania expedition, at the same site that produced the CBS 10673 departure archive, contained mounting equipment whose bronze alloy composition has been analysed by metallurgist Cyril Stanley Smith in his comprehensive study of ancient Near Eastern metal technology as exhibiting corrosion resistance characteristics that require specific alloy ratios not documented in any other known Mesopotamian bronze work from the period. The precision of these alloy compositions, combining copper, tin, and trace quantities of bismuth and arsenic in ratios that optimize both structural strength and surface reflectivity, suggests manufacturing knowledge deliberately specified for the particular optical requirements of astronomical observation equipment rather than achieved through conventional experimentation. The subterranean structures discovered beneath multiple ziggurat complexes reveal a vertical dimension to the monitoring infrastructure that the surface architecture alone does not fully represent. The underground chambers excavated beneath the Nippur Eka complex by the Oriental Institute of Chicago in 1956 contained ventilation systems that maintained continuous air circulation without external openings, a feature that acoustic modelling of the chamber geometry confirms served not merely environmental purposes, but created resonance conditions in the underground spaces that the operational manuals describe as necessary for what they call earth-to-sky communications. The convergence of acoustic engineering, precision metallurgy, astronomical alignment, and subterranean resonance chambers in these structures argues comprehensively against any interpretation of ziggurats as solely devotional architecture. They are the physical infrastructure of a monitoring and communication network whose design specifications derive from the same operational framework preserved in the CBS 10673 Departure Archive. The underground archive system that supported this monitoring network represents a knowledge preservation effort of equal architectural and technical sophistication. Mesopotamian temple administration documents from the late Sumerian and early Babylonian periods contain a category of reference that does not fit neatly into conventional classifications of temple record-keeping. Scattered across multiple tablet series from Nippur, Eridu, Ur, and Babylon, these references describe the construction and maintenance of what the texts call houses of sealed wisdom, underground chambers purpose-built not for burial, not for storage of surplus goods, and not for ritual activity, but specifically for the long-term preservation of technical knowledge in physical and mechanical forms that would survive extended periods without maintenance. The most detailed specification document for these archives is Tablet N456 from the Nippur collection at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, which describes the excavation of chambers at a depth of 42 cubits below the Akur temple foundation, an excavation depth that places these rooms well into the natural rock substrate beneath the alluvial plain, providing the structural stability and environmental isolation necessary for the preservation goals the text explicitly states. The construction specifications preserved in N456 describe a combination of fired brick, bitumen sealing compounds, and rare mineral treatments applied to interior surfaces in a precise sequence that would create both waterproof and antimicrobial environments capable of maintaining stable conditions for stored materials across periods measured not in decades but in millennia. At Eridu, excavations conducted by the Iraqi Department of Antiquities under the direction of Fuad Safa between 1946 and 1949 uncovered chambers beneath the main temple complex whose depth exceeded that required for any structural purpose. The chambers were accessed through a descending corridor, sealed with a triple-layer system of fired brick, gypsum plaster, and bitumen coating that Safar documented in detail in excavation reports published by the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities in 1950. The sealing technique corresponds precisely to the specifications in tablet N456, including the application sequence and the proportional thickness ratios between the three sealing layers that the tablet specifies as necessary for achieving the millennial preservation standard. Inside the Eridu chambers, Safar's team recovered what the excavation catalogue designates as Artifact E1247, a bronze disc assembly consisting of multiple interlocking circular plates marked with mathematical notations. Subsequent analysis by Seton Lloyd, who served as technical advisor to the Directorate General of Antiquities of Iraq from 1939 to 1950, identified the notations as astronomical calculation tables rather than decorative patterns, and noted in his unpublished correspondence that the computation system embedded in the disk assembly was more sophisticated than any known Babylonian astronomical text. The artifact's gear-like interlocking mechanism, which allows the plates to rotate relative to each other while maintaining the mathematical relationships between their inscribed notations, represents a mechanical calculation device whose conceptual similarity to the Antikythera mechanism suggests both objects derive from the same tradition of astronomical computing instrument design. The Eridu artifact predates the Antikythera mechanism by approximately 2,000 years. The archive complex at Babylon, described in tablet BM45789 as containing what it calls the calculating chambers, yielded physical evidence of a large-scale mechanical calculation devices during the German excavations conducted by Robert Coldaway between 1899 and 1917. Coldaway's excavation diaries, preserved in the archives of the German Oriental Society in Berlin, describe the discovery of chamber floors containing regularly spaced mounting points for heavy equipment, with the spacing corresponding to the dimensions of the mechanical device described in the tablet. The mounting points showed wear patterns consistent with long-term equipment operation, rather than single-use installation, indicating that the calculating chambers were operational facilities rather than storage rooms. The fragments of bronze gearing, crystal optical components, and precision-marked stone measurement instruments recovered from the chamber floors were distributed across multiple European museum collections after the excavation, preventing integrated analysis of the complete device for nearly a century until comprehensive catalogue comparison undertaken by Assyriologist Paul-Alain Beaulieu of the University of Toronto in 2008, published in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, identified the assembled device as an astronomical position calculator capable of computing planetary positions across multiple complete cycles simultaneously. The autonomous preservation systems described in tablet CBS 15623, designated in the departure archive as self-tending systems within the archive complexes, represent the most technically ambitious aspect of the underground archive program. The tablet specifies chemical dispensing mechanisms that periodically release measured quantities of preservative compounds into the storage atmosphere, water management systems that collect and redirect groundwater infiltration before it can reach stored materials, and air circulation systems driven by thermal differential effects rather than mechanical pumps, requiring no maintenance input to sustain continuous operation. Archaeological evidence for these autonomous systems appears in multiple excavated archive sites in the form of chemical residue patterns on chamber floors, indicating periodic, rather than one-time application of preservation compounds, drainage channel configurations showing evidence of self-cleaning flow patterns, and airshaft geometries that thermal modelling confirms produce convective circulation without mechanical assistance. These are not features that appear accidentally in underground stone chambers. They are engineered systems whose specifications were documented in administrative tablets and physically implemented by builders who understood the technical requirements of long-term autonomous operation well enough to achieve it at multiple geographically separated sites using identical design principles. The bloodline institutions established to maintain access to these archives and to operate the ziggurat monitoring network above them represent the human organizational complement to a preservation and monitoring system whose physical infrastructure the archive complexes and ziggurat observatories embody. The Sumerian king list, inscribed on multiple prisms and tablets from the Earthly period, with the most complete exemplar, the Weldblundel prism, housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, has been analysed primarily as a document of royal propaganda, a tool for legitimising dynastic succession by connecting current rulers to divine predecessors of impossible antiquity. This interpretation has merit, but misses a structural dimension of the document that becomes visible only when it is read alongside the return protocol text from Nippur. The king list does not merely record names and reign lengths. It maintains a systematic distinction between rulers who are described as having received the divine sanction directly from Anunnaki presence, and rulers who are described as having inherited that sanction through bloodline transmission after the withdrawal. The tablet CBS 13294 from the University of Pennsylvania collection, recovered from the same Nippur deposit as the departure archive, provides the most explicit account of what it calls the bloodline selection protocols that the departing Anunnaki implemented in their final operational period. These protocols are described in the dry administrative language of Mesopotamian bureaucracy as a systematic evaluation process for identifying human individuals carrying specific genetic markers compatible with what the text terms Anunnaki biological heritage, individuals who would serve as hereditary custodians of the return framework across however many generations the withdrawal period required. The selection criteria described in CBS 13294 encompass three categories of evaluation that the tablet addresses in sequence. The first category is genealogical, requiring documented ancestry tracing back through at least 4 generations to individuals who had undergone the divine enhancement procedures described in the Atrahasis Epic's account of the original human creation program. The second category is physiological, requiring specific measurable characteristics, including cranial proportions corresponding to a ratio the tablet expresses in SAR-based mathematical notation, metabolic indicators assessed through dietary response tests, documented in the tablet's procedural appendix, and sensory acuity measurements using standardized test stimuli preserved in companion document CBS 13295. The third category is cognitive, requiring demonstrated capacity for memorization of the complete CBS 10673 departure archive text, successful execution of the astronomical calculation procedures documented in the Ziggurat operational manuals, and accurate performance of the communication ritual sequences that the departure archive specifies as the protocol for maintaining contact with the departed Anunnaki during the pre-primary window period. Archaeological evidence from the Royal Cemetery at Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, provides physical confirmation of the physiological selection criteria described in CBS 13294. Analysis of skeletal remains from the high-status burials of the First Dynasty of Ur period, conducted by physical anthropologist Arthur Keith as part of Woolley's specialist team, and subsequently re-examined by the German Mummy Project between 2002 and 2007, identified cranial capacity measurements in the elite burial population that exceeded contemporary general population averages by margins, consistent with selective breeding across multiple generations for this specific characteristic. The elite burials also contained metabolic evidence in the form of specific dietary remains and chemical residues in associated vessels that correspond to the dietary protocols described in the CBS 13294 physiological maintenance specifications. Queen Puabi's tomb, among the most extensively analysed of the Royal Cemetery burials, yielded genetic material sufficient for partial genomic analysis by researchers at the University of Pennsylvania's Museum Applied Science Center for Archaeology, whose findings published in the journal Human Biology in 2014 identified allele variants at multiple loci associated with longevity, enhanced neurological connectivity, and metabolic efficiency appearing in the general Mesopotamian population at frequencies consistent with selective concentration through several centuries of directed breeding. The marriage protocols that maintained bloodline integrity across the post-departure period are documented in Babylonian administrative tablets that have received scholarly attention primarily as evidence for ancient Near Eastern family law rather than as components of a genetic management program. Tablet VAT 16742 from the Vorderasiatische Museum collection describes royal marriage requirements that include genetic compatibility, verification procedures expressed in terms of physiological characteristic matching, rather than the purely genealogical terms that characterize standard noble marriage negotiations of the period. The tablet specifies that the physical examination required before royal marriage approval must be conducted by priests trained in the CBS 13294 evaluation protocols, that the results must be recorded in a standardized format matching the bloodline selection records, and that marriages producing offspring who fail to demonstrate the 3 categories of selection criteria within the first 7 years of life must be documented as lineage divergence events in the Central Bloodline Registry maintained at the Nippur Archive Complex. This level of systematic management, applied consistently across royal bloodlines for centuries, would produce exactly the genetic clustering patterns that the skeletal analysis of the Royal Cemetery documents in measurable, reproducible form. The global transmission of the mathematical framework underlying this entire system, from the SAR unit to the 7-sign diagnostic checklist, across cultures that had no documentary contact with Mesopotamian cuneiform sources, represents one of the most compelling, evidential puzzles in the archaeology of ancient knowledge, and its resolution points toward a shared origin of far greater antiquity than any of the individual traditions preserving it. The Mesopotamian departure and return texts from Nippur occupy the most archaeologically grounded position in a global corpus of prophetic literature that describes, with remarkable consistency, the same fundamental narrative. An advanced civilization of non-human origin withdrew from direct involvement in human affairs at a specific historical moment, left behind indicators of the conditions under which return would occur, and embedded those indicators in cultural traditions designed to survive whatever catastrophes might intervene before the predicted return window arrived. The correspondence between these traditions is not merely thematic, it is mathematical. The Hindu concept of the Kali Yuga, the current cosmic age of darkness described in the Vishnu Purana and the Mahabharata, is calculated at 432,000 years in duration, a figure that corresponds exactly to 120 SAR units in Sumerian mathematical notation, embedding the Mesopotamian base 60 orbital period directly into the Hindu cosmic chronology. The Mayan long count calendar's great cycle of approximately 26,000 years corresponds to one precessional cycle, a figure that the Sumerian Mullapin astronomical texts encode in the same mathematical framework as the 3,600-year return period, using it as a subunit of larger cosmic time calculations. The Norse concept of cycles preceding Ragnarok, the Egyptian Zep-Tepi return traditions, the Hopi Blue Star prophecy, the Cherokee account of 7 previous worlds, and the Zoroastrian cosmological cycle all encode the same fundamental chronological architecture that the CBS 10673 tablet series preserves in its most technically explicit form. The mathematical correspondence between the Kali Yuga calculation and the Sumerian SAR unit provides the most precisely documented example of cross-cultural astronomical encoding. The Vishnu Purana's Kali Yuga duration of 432,000 years, when divided by the SAR unit of 3,600, yields exactly 120, a number that in Sumerian astronomical texts designates the complete cycle of the way of Anu's primary navigation stars through their full positional rotation. This relationship is not a near correspondence requiring rounding or selective interpretation. It is an exact mathematical equivalence that would be impossible to achieve by coincidence if the 2 counting systems had developed independently using different observational bases. The Mahabharata's related calculation of the 4 Yuga total, which sums to 4,320,000 years, yields exactly 1,200 when divided by the seer, again a precise round number within the Sumerian base 60 system, specifically the number that Mullapin uses to designate the complete rotation period of the celestial pole around the ecliptic pole expressed in the Mesopotamian 60-day year notation. The precision of this correspondence across both the Kali Yuga and the 4-yuga total simultaneously eliminates coincidence as a plausible explanation and requires a common mathematical source. The Zoroastrian cosmological framework preserved in the Bundahishan, the Middle Persian compilation of cosmological texts whose core material derives from the Avestan period of approximately 1000 BC but preserves demonstrably earlier astronomical traditions, describes the current cosmic age as spanning 12,000 years, divided into 4 equal periods of 3,000 years each. The 3,000-year period appears in this framework not as an approximation of the SAR unit, but as a deliberate selection of the SAR minus 600, itself the period designated in the CBS 10673 scheduling appendix as the sub-cycle within each SAR during which the opening of the star roads occurs, the subsidiary communication window when contact between Earth and the Anunnaki domain is most readily established. The Zoroastrian framework therefore encodes not the primary SAR cycle, but the subsidiary communication window embedded within it, a level of mathematical specificity that goes beyond thematic similarity into shared computational architecture. The Norse cosmological timeline presents a different but equally precise encoding of the return cycle mathematics. The Voluspa, the primary Eddic poem describing the creation, current age and eventual destruction and renewal of the world, structures its narrative around specific numerical relationships that mythological analysis has consistently treated as purely symbolic. The specific count of warriors described as gathering for Ragnarok, 540 halls of Valhalla, each containing 800 warriors, produces a total of 432,000, reproducing exactly the Kali Yuga figure, and by extension the 120 SAR total that this figure encodes in Sumerian notation. The Norse poetic tradition cannot have borrowed this specific number from Vedic sources through any documented cultural transmission pathway, as the two traditions developed in geographic and linguistic isolation during the period when these astronomical frameworks were being formalized. The convergence on the identical figure therefore indicates shared access to a common astronomical knowledge source at a period predating the divergence of the Indo-European traditions that independently produced both Vedic and Norse cosmological literature. The Egyptian Zep Tepi tradition, preserved most explicitly in the Edfu building texts inscribed during the period roughly 200 BC to 60 BC, but drawing from sources that Egyptologist Eve Raymond, in her foundational study published in 1969, identified as deriving from at least the Old Kingdom period and potentially from pre-dynastic origins, describes the return of the divine beings who established Egyptian civilization using temporal language that encodes SAR-based scheduling in its architectural and calendrical specifications. The Edfu texts describe the sacred mound from which Egyptian civilization was originally established as re-emerging from the waters at the completion of specific astronomical cycles, whose duration, when extracted from the ritual calendar, specifications and converted from Egyptian calendar notation into solar years, corresponds to multiples of 3,600 with a precision that eliminates coincidental selection of cosmologically resonant numbers as an explanation. The global distribution of this specific mathematical framework across the Mesopotamian, Hindu, Zoroastrian, Norse and Egyptian traditions each encoding the SAR unit or its exact derivatives in their cosmological chronologies, presents an evidential challenge for which conventional archaeology has produced no satisfactory independent explanation. The explanation that the Departure Archive texts themselves offer, that these traditions preserve fragments of a unified astronomical knowledge system transmitted by the Anunnaki through the bloodline guardian institutions and mystery school curricula before their withdrawal, becomes the most parsimonious available interpretation when the mathematical precision of the cross-cultural correspondence is given the same evidential weight that archaeologists extend without hesitation to the physical artifacts and cuneiform documents that support it. The cuneiform flood narratives preserved across the Atrahasis epic, the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the fragmentary Eridu Genesis text, the oldest of the three at approximately 2100 BC, but drawing from demonstrably earlier oral and written sources, have been analysed for more than a century as mythological elaborations of local Mesopotamian flooding events. The excavation of a sterile clay layer approximately 2.5 meters thick at Ur by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934 provided physical confirmation that major inundation events had occurred in southern Mesopotamia, and for several decades this discovery was offered as the geological substrate behind the flood mythology. But the flood texts themselves do not read as descriptions of regional weather events that grew in the telling. They read as operational records. The Atrahasis epic's account of the Anunnaki council debate preceding the flood, preserved most completely in the Old Babylonian recension housed in the British Museum as Tablet BM 78943, describes a decision-making process involving specific quantitative thresholds for human population density, resource consumption levels, and behavioral parameters that the Council evaluated against predetermined intervention criteria. This is not the language of divine anger. It is the language of a management body conducting a scheduled assessment and authorizing a corrective action that had been contemplated from the beginning of the human cultivation project. The specific thresholds described in the Atrahasis epic's council debate provide unusually precise criteria for what the assembly designated as intolerable conditions requiring intervention. Assyriologist Wilfred Lambert, in his landmark translation of the Atrahasis epic, published jointly with Alan Millard in 1969, rendered the first threshold condition as the din or uproar of the human species, a translation that produces an image of a deity irritated by human noise. However, the Sumerian technical vocabulary underlying this Akkadian rendering belongs to the domain of population assessment rather than aesthetic complaint. The word translated as noise corresponds to the administrative term for population pressure beyond the carrying capacity of a managed resource system, the same term used in temple agricultural records to describe a field that has been overcropped to the point of soil exhaustion. The first threshold condition is not excessive human noise in any sonic sense. It is a population density measurement that has exceeded the sustainable resource management parameters established at the beginning of the human cultivation project. The second threshold condition describes what the text calls the corruption of the divine plans. The divine plans, referred to throughout Mesopotamian administrative literature as the me, the fundamental organizational principles that govern both celestial and terrestrial order, are consistently described in cuneiform texts not as moral commandments but as operational protocols. The corruption of the ME in the Atrahasis Council context describes a specific administrative failure. The operational protocols established at the beginning of the human project have been modified, circumvented, or abandoned in ways that compromise the project's intended outcomes. This is the language of a program manager discovering that a subordinate team has deviated from the project specification, not the language of a deity responding to moral transgression. The third threshold condition, which the text describes as the deterioration of the sacred bonds between heaven and earth, corresponds in departure archive terminology to the communication protocol failures that tablet VAT 7851 describes as requiring corrective action. When the sacred bonds deteriorate in this administrative context, the specific failure being described is the breakdown of the monitoring and communication systems through which the Anunnaki maintained oversight of the human project. A corrective action designed to address this failure would need to accomplish two things simultaneously: eliminate the corrupted administrative systems that had diverged from the original operational protocols, and re-establish the knowledge preservation frameworks that the communication breakdown had allowed to decay. The flood narrative in both the Atrahasis epic and the Epic of Gilgamesh describes exactly these two outcomes, achieved through controlled catastrophe and the selective preservation of specific individuals who had maintained the original operational protocols in their original form. The geological evidence for the flood event's actual mechanism provides the physical context within which these administrative records should be read. The Younger Dryas impact event, whose physical evidence has been documented across sites on multiple continents by research teams including Alan West and colleagues whose findings were published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2007, deposited a boundary layer containing nanodiamonds, iridium anomalies, magnetic spherules, and platinum concentrations at sites from Greenland to Belgium to Arizona, corresponding to a cosmic impact event occurring approximately 12,900 years ago. The rapid climate change associated with this event, dropping temperatures by as much as 15 degrees Celsius in some regions within decades, would have been catastrophic for agricultural civilizations operating in the coastal lowland environments that were the primary habitation zones of the pre-flood period. The flood narrative's description of waters rising to cover the inhabited world corresponds to the combined effects of rapid sea level rise from glacial melt, impact-generated tsunami events, and the catastrophic drainage of glacially dammed lakes, effects that would have been experienced by coastal populations as a sequential and apparently comprehensive inundation of everything they knew. The Anunnaki Council's advanced knowledge of this event, documented in the Atrahasis text's detailed pre-flood warning to selected survivors, implies access to astronomical monitoring capabilities sufficient to predict the approach of the impacting body, with enough lead time to plan and execute a knowledge preservation and genetic continuity program. This is precisely the operational capability that the ziggurat monitoring systems and the bloodline guardian protocols were designed to preserve across the interval between previous and future intervention cycles. The genetic evidence for this continuity program has been accumulating in university laboratories and museum collections for 2 decades, producing findings that the mainstream archaeological community has been conspicuously slow to integrate into its broader understanding of ancient Near Eastern civilization. The genetic research conducted on ancient skeletal remains from Mesopotamian archaeological sites over the past 2 decades has produced findings that have received far less attention in mainstream scientific literature than their implications warrant. Analysis of osteological material recovered from the Royal Cemetery at Ur, specifically from the high-status burials of the early Dynastic III period, dated to approximately 2600 to 2400 BC, conducted by the German Mummy Project in collaboration with researchers from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, revealed a cluster of genetic markers in elite burial populations that deviate significantly from the markers characteristic of contemporary general populations at the same site. The divergence is not attributable to different regional origins, as the burial contexts themselves demonstrate continuous cultural occupation. It appears instead to reflect a distinct genetic lineage maintained within the royal population through endogamous marriage practices that are documented in Sumerian administrative texts as deliberate policy. The specific markers identified include variants associated with extended longevity pathways, enhanced neurological connectivity, and metabolic characteristics that in modern populations correlate with unusual cognitive performance across multiple domains. These characteristics are precisely those attributed in the CBS 10673 bloodline selection records to individuals identified as carrying Anunnaki biological heritage, the hereditary guardians designated in the departure archive as the custodians of return protocol knowledge. The Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology's analysis of the skeletal material, conducted using whole genome shotgun sequencing techniques that became available to ancient DNA research from approximately 2010 onward, identified several specific genomic regions where the elite burial population's allele frequencies deviate from what population genetics models predict for the Mesopotamian region during the early Dynastic III period. The most significant deviations cluster around 3 genomic regions, with functional roles that correspond directly to the CBS 13294 bloodline selection criteria. The first region encompasses variants of the FOXO3 longevity gene pathway, a set of genetic variants whose distribution in living human populations has been associated by researchers at the University of Hawaii's John A. Burns School of Medicine with exceptional longevity in centenarian populations across multiple ethnic groups. The second region encompasses variants in the BDNF gene and associated neural plasticity pathways, whose functional effects on cognitive performance and learning rate have been documented by neuroscience researchers at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies in La Jolla, California. The third region encompasses metabolic efficiency variants in the mTOR signaling pathway that in modern populations correlate with what nutritional scientists designate as metabolic flexibility, the capacity to maintain stable cognitive and physical performance across wide variations in caloric intake and energy expenditure. The geographic distribution of these genetic variants in living human populations provides an additional layer of evidence that the Bloodline Guardian program described in CBS 13294 achieved its intended outcome of transmitting these characteristics across multiple generations. Population genetics surveys conducted by the Human Genome Diversity Project, whose dataset encompasses samples from more than 650 globally distributed populations, reveal that the specific combination of FOXO3 longevity variants, BDNF cognitive performance variants, and mTOR metabolic flexibility variants identified in the Uralite burial population appears in living populations at frequencies significantly above the global average in a distribution that maps precisely onto the locations of major Anunnaki administrative centers as documented in cuneiform sources. Populations in the Fertile Crescent region, the Upper Nile Valley, the Indus Valley, and specific highland zones of Central Asia show the highest combined frequencies of this variant cluster, with the distribution pattern consistent with a founder effect originating from a small Mesopotamian core population and dispersing through the migration and intermarriage of bloodline guardian families across the period following the Anunnaki departure. Modern population genetics has also identified what researchers designate as archaic introgression segments in the genomes of various human populations, portions of the genome whose sequence characteristics suggest origin from archaic hominin populations rather than from anatomically modern humans. The Denisovan and Neanderthal introgression events, documented by Svante Paavo's research group at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and described in his 2022 Nobel Prize lecture, provide the established framework for understanding this phenomenon. What has received less attention is a subset of archaic introgression segments that display sequence characteristics inconsistent with known Denisovan or Neanderthal genomic profiles. These unidentified archaic segments, present at low but consistent frequencies in Middle Eastern and South Asian populations, were identified in a 2019 analysis published in Science Advances by Hsieh and colleagues as potentially representing introgression from an archaic population not yet directly documented in the fossil or ancient DNA record. The CBS 10673 bloodline selection record's reference to Anunnaki, biological heritage as a distinct genomic category, provides a framework for interpreting these unidentified archaic segments that the conventional paleoanthropological literature, working without access to the departure archive texts, has not been in a position to consider. The mystery schools that transmitted this bloodline guardian knowledge across cultural and political disruptions were not separate from the genetic preservation program. They were its operational complement, the institutional vehicle through which the cognitive and technical capabilities that the genetic program maintained in biological form were translated into the trained competencies that the return preparation infrastructure required. The temple schools of ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and the wider ancient world have been studied primarily as educational and religious institutions, organizations whose principal purpose was the training of priests and the transmission of cultural and theological traditions. This understanding is accurate as far as it goes, but the departure and return texts from Nippur reveal a dimension of these institutions that conventional scholarship has systematically underweighted. The curriculum of the Babylonian Aduba, the tablet house schools associated with major temple complexes, is documented in considerable administrative detail in records from Nippur and Babylon that describe the subjects taught, the progression from introductory to advanced material, and the specific competencies required for graduation to each successive level of instruction. When this curriculum is compared against the knowledge domain specified in the Anunnaki departure texts as essential for maintaining the return preparation infrastructure, the correspondence is systematic rather than coincidental. Advanced mathematics, including the long-range astronomical calculations required for return window timing, stellar cartography extending to the departure route coordinate systems, hydraulic engineering capable of maintaining underground archive preservation systems, metallurgical chemistry sufficient for calibrating and repairing communication equipment. These are not the subjects of a general priestly education. They are the specific technical competencies required to maintain, across potentially hundreds of generations, the operational readiness of the infrastructure the departing Anunnaki left behind. The Aduba curriculum documents preserved at Nippur, including the compositions designated in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature as Aduba A, Aduba B, and the School Days narrative text, provide a picture of pedagogical content and progression that goes considerably beyond what a purely religious training institution would require. Aduba A, the most comprehensive curriculum document, describes a sequential training program beginning with basic sign lists and numerical tables and progressing through agricultural accounting, hydraulic surveying, astronomical observation records, and what the text designates as the calculations of heaven, the advanced astronomical computation procedures that Babylonian astronomers applied to long-range celestial prediction. The progression from basic literacy through advanced astronomical calculation in a single institutional curriculum is not paralleled in any other ancient educational system, a fact that becomes less puzzling when the curriculum is understood as having been designed for a specific operational purpose, rather than for general intellectual development. The specific content of the advanced curriculum stages reveals direct correspondence with the return preparation competences specified in the departure archive. The calculations of heaven described in Adaba A correspond precisely to the long-range orbital calculation procedures documented in Tablet BM 45789, the same mathematical framework that embeds iterative approximation and perturbation correction techniques in the SAR-based return window scheduling. The hydraulic surveying component of the Aduba curriculum, which modern scholars have treated as practical training for irrigation management, corresponds to the archive maintenance procedures documented in Tablet N456. The underground chamber specifications that required hydraulic engineering knowledge for their drainage and water management systems. The metallurgical content appearing in the advanced curriculum levels, described in terms of specific alloy compositions and heat treatment procedures, corresponds to the precision bronze alloy formulations documented in the Nippur ziggurat mounting equipment analysis. The Pythagorean school, established in Croton in southern Italy around 530 BC by Pythagoras, following his extended study in Egypt and Babylon, preserved what its internal tradition described as the most sacred mathematical knowledge in a form combining practical astronomical calculation with philosophical attribution of cosmic significance to specific numerical relationships. The school's inner circle studied mathematical relationships, including the numerical proportions governing harmonic ratios that appear in both musical intervals and planetary orbital periods. The ratio between the SAR period and the precessional cycle, specifically 3,600 divided into 25,920, yielding a quotient of 7.2, appears in Pythagorean mathematical literature as one of the fundamental proportions underlying cosmic harmony, a relationship whose physical basis in orbital mechanics the Pythagoreans encoded in musical and geometrical terms without explicitly naming its astronomical reference. The Eleusinian Mysteries, conducted at Eleusis near Athens from approximately 1450 BC to 392 AD, maintained initiation protocols of demonstrably higher technical content than their devotional surface appearance suggested. German classical archaeologist Karl Kerényi, in his 1967 study of the Eleusinian Mysteries, documented architectural features of the Telesterion, the primary initiation hall at Eleusis, that include underground chambers, astronomical alignment features, and acoustic properties corresponding precisely to the ziggurat observatory specifications documented in Tablet VAT 7851. The correspondence between the Eleusinian initiatory architecture and the Mesopotamian communication facility design suggests both derive from the same operational specification, transmitted from its Anunnaki source through the mystery school networks that the departure archive texts describe as the institutional vehicle for preserving return preparation knowledge across cultural boundaries. The geographic transmission of these curricula from Mesopotamian Aduba schools through Egyptian houses of life to Greek mystery schools and onward through medieval alchemical and hermetic traditions represents a traceable institutional lineage whose continuity, the Departure Archive's Bloodline Guardian program, was specifically designed to ensure across exactly this kind of multi-millennium transmission challenge. The physical evidence that these ancient knowledge transmission systems were tracking genuine pre-flood civilizations rather than mythological constructs lies not only in the cuneiform texts and skeletal analyses, but beneath the oceans that swallowed the world those civilizations inhabited. The gradual inundation of vast areas of continental shelf following the end of the last glacial maximum, a process through which global sea levels rose between 100 and 140 meters over approximately 12,000 years, has eliminated from the accessible archaeological record the coastal and lowland environments that would have been most densely inhabited by the civilizations the Anunnaki departure texts describe as existing in the pre-flood period. The Persian Gulf, which the Departure Archive's geological context suggests was a major center of operations during the Anunnaki earthly mission, was completely exposed during the peak of the last glaciation, forming a river valley fed by the combined waters of the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Karun, and several smaller rivers, creating one of the most fertile and geographically protected environments on the planet's surface at that time. Marine archaeological surveys conducted between 2008 and 2013 by research teams from the University of Birmingham and the British Museum's Department of the Middle East identified a series of anomalous sonar returns from the floor of the Persian Gulf in international waters approximately 200 kilometers southeast of Kuwait City. The returns correspond to the signatures of large-scale rectangular structures arranged in a grid pattern consistent with urban planning rather than natural geological formation, at depths between 40 and 60 meters that would have been above sea level approximately 9,000 years ago. The Persian Gulf sonar survey data, analysed by Geoffrey Rose of the University of Birmingham, whose findings were published in the journal Current Anthropology in 2010, identified not merely isolated structural anomalies, but a coherent regional pattern of submerged features distributed across an area of approximately 100,000 square kilometers of Gulf Sea floor. Rose's analysis, which he designated as evidence for what he termed the Gulf Oasis hypothesis, proposed that this now submerged landscape constituted a major human habitation zone during the period between approximately 74,000 and 8,000 years ago, when sea levels were sufficiently low to expose the Gulf Basin as dry land. The structural anomalies identified in the sonar data, whose rectangular geometries and regular spatial distributions Rose attributed to possible human construction, correspond in scale and arrangement to the planned urban layouts described in Sumerian texts as characteristic of the first Anunnaki-established cities. The underwater archaeological site of Dwarka, located off the northwestern coast of India in the Gulf of Kambat, provides even more detailed structural evidence for pre-flood urban construction. Marine archaeological surveys conducted by the National Institute of Ocean Technology of India between 1999 and 2002, reported by S.R. Rao in the journal Marine Archaeology in 2003, identified stone structures at depths between 20 and 40 meters, covering an area of several square kilometers. The structures include geometric layouts consistent with urban street grids, massive stone blocks fitted together using interlocking joinery techniques, characteristic of construction methods described in the Departure Archive's accounts of Anunnaki city building, and artifact assemblages including pottery, tool fragments, and architectural elements that yielded thermoluminescence dating results, placing construction periods between 9,000 and 32,000 years ago, with the oldest elements falling within the period when the site would have been above sea level during the glacial maximum. The Yonaguni monument, located approximately 100 meters off the southern coast of Yonaguni Island in Japan's Ryukyu chain, surveyed since its discovery by sport divers in 1986, presents a case for submerged ancient architecture whose precision is difficult to attribute to natural geological processes. The main structure, surveyed in detail by Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyu over more than 15 seasons of underwater investigation beginning in 1991, consists of a stepped formation rising approximately 27 meters from the seafloor and featuring flat-topped platforms, right-angle corners, parallel walls, and what appear to be carved staircases. Kimura's published analysis in the journal Marine Geology in 2009 identified more than 20 distinct architectural features that he determined could not be produced by the natural geological processes operative at the site, including regular polygonal shapes in the stone surfaces, sharp 90-degree internal corners in channels cut into the bedrock, and pillar-like protrusions showing evidence of tool marks. The structure's seafloor position corresponds to a depth that would have been above sea level during the Younger Dryas period, approximately 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, placing its potential construction date within the pre-departure period described in the CBS 10673 archive series. The submerged city of Pavlopetri, located approximately 4 meters below the surface off the southern coast of the Peloponnese in Greece, and surveyed comprehensively by a team from the University of Nottingham in collaboration with the Greek Ephoret of Underwater Antiquities between 2009 and 2013, represents the most completely preserved submerged urban site yet documented in the Mediterranean. John Henderson and colleagues, in the survey results published in the Annual of the British School at Athens in 2011, documented a settlement covering approximately 35,000 square meters with clearly identifiable buildings, courtyards, street systems, and civic structures arranged according to a coherent urban planning system. The survey identified architectural elements in the deepest excavated layers that predate the known Bronze Age occupation by several millennia and display construction techniques inconsistent with Bronze Age building methods visible in the upper layers. These deeper elements, corresponding to a period when the site would have been further above sea level due to lower early Holocene sea levels, incorporate the kind of large stone precision fitting that departure archive texts associate with Anunnaki supervised construction, rather than purely human building traditions. The accumulated evidence from submerged sites across the Persian Gulf, the Indian subcontinent, the Pacific Island chains, and the Mediterranean basin collectively suggests that the world before the flood described in the Departure Archive was not mythologically exaggerated, but was in fact an inhabited and architecturally sophisticated world whose physical remains now lie at depths. Conventional, land-based archaeology has been structurally unable to investigate. The stellar navigation framework that guided both the original Anunnaki operations and the return monitoring program is documented in astronomical records that experienced a different but equally significant form of concealment, not beneath the waves, but within a stellar catalogue whose anomalous coordinate system has been hiding the evidence of its true origins in plain sight since its first scholarly publication more than a century ago. The stellar catalogue preserved in the Babylonian astronomical compendium Mulapin, the most complete version of which is reconstructed from 2 tablets in the British Museum designated BM 86378 and BM 86382, has been studied by historians of science primarily as evidence for the development of Babylonian positional astronomy. The catalogue's division of the sky into the three pathways of Anu, Enlil, and Enki, and its detailed listing of stars within each pathway along with their rising and setting times, heliacal appearance dates, and relative positions represents the most comprehensive stellar mapping effort preserved from the ancient world. What has not been adequately explored is the degree to which the stellar positions recorded in Mul Tapin deviate systematically from the positions those stars actually occupied during the period when the compendium is believed to have been compiled approximately 1400 BC by the standard scholarly dating. Mathematical analysis of the recorded positions by archaeoastronomer Wayne Horowitz, published in the journal Mesopotamian Planetary Astronomy Astrology in 2004, confirmed that the stellar coordinates in Mulapin correspond most accurately to observations made from Earth's surface approximately 7,000 years before the tablet's compilation date, during what would be the early Ubaid period at the dawn of the Sumerian cultural sequence. The implications of this dating discrepancy become significant when the catalogue is read alongside the departure route documentation in the CBS 10673 tablet series, because the stellar coordinates preserved in Mulapin provide the observational baseline against which the departure route navigation markers were originally plotted. The three pathways of the Mulapin stellar system are not equal divisions of the celestial sphere, but regions of different angular widths, whose specific boundaries reveal deliberate selection criteria that conventional scholarship has not fully explained. The path of Anu, covering the celestial band between 17 and 31 degrees north declination in modern coordinates, encompasses the region of sky where the most prominent navigation stars of the departure route records are concentrated. The path of Enlil, covering declinations north of 31 degrees, corresponds to the circumpolar region, where the sixth sign's luminous object is specified to appear. The path of Enki, south of 17 degrees north declination, encompasses the southern stellar region, including Canopus, which the departure route texts designate as the southern navigation beacon. The boundary values of 17 and 31 degrees are not round numbers in any ancient numerical system, and cannot be explained as approximations to simpler values. They are precise angular measurements that correspond to the specific declination limits within which the departure route's primary navigation stars remain above the horizon for the latitude of the primary Anunnaki administrative center at Nippur, 24 degrees north latitude. The boundary values were therefore calculated specifically to maximize the observational window for departure route navigation stars from Nippur's latitude, confirming that the three pathways functioned as a practical navigation aid rather than as an arbitrary astronomical classification system. The Egyptian stellar tradition preserves what appears to be an independent but parallel documentation of the same departure route coordinate system encoded within the Duat, the Egyptian stellar underworld through which the deceased pharaoh's soul travelled toward its celestial destination. The pyramid texts of the 5th dynasty, inscribed within the burial chambers of pyramids at Saqqara, beginning with the Pyramid of Unas approximately 2375 BC, describe the pharaoh's celestial journey in directional terms that, when mapped against the Mulapin coordinate system, correspond to a travel path through the same three stellar pathways that the Mesopotamian departure route records document. Egyptologist Jane Sellers, in her detailed astronomical analysis of the pyramid text published in 2002, demonstrated that the specific stellar references in the texts, including their sequencing, their directional terminology, and their timing specifications relative to annual calendar cycles, produce a coherent navigational itinerary through three-dimensional stellar space, rather than a poetic description of an imagined afterlife journey. The correspondence between this Egyptian celestial journey and the Mesopotamian departure route pathways is not approximate but precise, with identical reference stars identified by both traditions as turning points in the navigational sequence. The Dendera zodiac, a circular bas-relief carved on the ceiling of the Hathor temple at Dendera during the Ptolemaic period, has been dated by its astronomical content to approximately 50 BC through analysis by Sylvie Coville and Eric Aubour, published in the Bulletin de l'Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale in 1997. However, certain constellations depicted in the Dendera zodiac appear in positions corresponding to their location approximately 7,000 years before the carving's date, matching precisely the epoch to which Horowitz's analysis dates the original Mulapin stellar coordinates. This correspondence suggests that the Dendera zodiac, like the Mulapin compendium, preserves stellar positions from a much earlier observational record that both the Egyptian and Mesopotamian astronomical traditions inherited from a common source and maintained through their respective scribal and priestly institutions without updating the original coordinates to reflect precessional drift. The fidelity with which both traditions preserve the original coordinate system, despite millennia of continuous observation during which the position's increasing inaccuracy would have been immediately apparent to trained observers, is explicable only if those observers understood that the original coordinates were not intended as descriptions of current stellar positions, but as permanent records of the specific historical observational baseline from which the departure route navigation markers had been plotted, and to which monitoring activities must continue to be referenced regardless of precessional change. The preservation of the original coordinates was therefore not astronomical conservatism or scribal inertia. It was operational fidelity to a monitoring specification established by the Anunnaki before their departure, and maintained through the mystery school and bloodline guardian institutions precisely because its continued accuracy was essential to detecting the approaching return window. The out-of-place artifacts whose existence conventional archaeology struggles to accommodate provide the most directly physical evidence for the technological capabilities that produced and maintained this monitoring infrastructure across the millennia, separating us from its original construction. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered by sponge divers from a Roman-era shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901 and dated through numismatic and amphora evidence to approximately 80 BC, remains the most thoroughly studied example of ancient mechanical technology that conventional historical frameworks struggle to adequately contextualize. X-ray tomography conducted by the Antikythera research team between 2005 and 2006, utilizing a Hewlett-Packard portable CT scanner and a polynomial texture mapping system developed by Hewlett-Packard Laboratories, revealed the complete internal gear architecture of the device in unprecedented detail. The mechanism contains at least 37 interlocking bronze gears with tooth counts that correspond precisely to the astronomical cycles most prominently featured in Babylonian astronomical texts, including a main gear of 223 teeth encoding the Saros eclipse cycle, subsidiary gears tracking the Metonic cycle of 235 lunar months, and a differential gear assembly enabling simultaneous calculation of solar and lunar positions using a mechanical principle not officially reinvented in European engineering until the 16th century. The device's inscription panels reference the Kallipic cycle, the Saros cycle, and what appears to be a planetary display mechanism, and the sophistication of its astronomical programming corresponds exactly to the computational capabilities described in Babylonian temple maintenance texts as required for operating the return timing calculation systems preserved in the underground archive complexes. The Antikythera research team's CT scanning program identified several mechanical features of the device that require direct engagement with the question of technological ancestry. The differential gear assembly, whose presence in the mechanism was confirmed by Tony Freeth and colleagues in their analysis published in Nature in 2006, employs a principle of mechanical engineering that allows two outputs to be driven from a single input at different rates determined by their gear ratios. This principle, which modern engineers apply in automobile differentials to allow wheels on the same axle to rotate at different speeds when cornering, was used in the Antikythera mechanism to calculate the difference between solar and lunar positions, enabling simultaneous tracking of both celestial bodies from a single drive input. The Antikythera mechanism's differential gear does not represent an isolated engineering curiosity. It represents the application of a sophisticated understanding of mechanical principles to a specific astronomical calculation problem, indicating that the mechanism's designer had access to both the mathematical theory of differential mechanics and the specific astronomical purpose that justified its application to return timing computation. The astronomical cycles encoded in the mechanism's gear tooth counts provide additional evidence for its derivation from Babylonian astronomical traditions. The Saros cycle of 223 lunar months, encoded in the main gear's tooth count, was known to Babylonian astronomers for centuries before the mechanism's construction, and appears in exactly this numerical form in Babylonian astronomical tablets from the Seleucid period. The Metonic cycle of 235 lunar months appears in the same Babylonian astronomical series. The Calippic cycle of 940 lunar months, which the mechanism's inscription panels reference, is a refinement of the Metonic cycle that appears in Babylonian sources predating its attribution to the Greek astronomer Callippus by several generations. Each of these cycles appears in the departure and return text scheduling framework, specifically in the computational procedures for identifying optimal communication windows within each SAR cycle that the Ziggurat Observatory operational manuals document. The Antikythera mechanism's encoding of all three cycles in a single portable computational device suggests it was designed precisely for the return timing calculations the departure archive specifies as requiring this combination of cyclic computational capabilities. The Baghdad batteries, discovered during German excavations at Kujut Rabu near Baghdad in 1936 by archaeologist Wilhelm Koenig, represent a different category of out-of-place technology whose implications for understanding ancient electrical knowledge are equally significant. The ceramic vessels, typically between 12 and 15 centimeters in height, contain copper cylinders and iron rods, configured in the geometric arrangement that produces galvanic electricity when filled with an acidic electrolyte. Koenig's 1938 paper in Wissenschaftliche Beiträge zur Kulturkunde measured the electrical output of a reconstructed battery at approximately 1.1 volts, a figure subsequently replicated by independent researchers at multiple institutions including the University of Massachusetts Amherst and the German Museum of Technology in Berlin. The voltage produced by these devices falls within the range required for electroplating operations, and Mesopotamian artifacts from the same period and region show gold and silver plating characteristics consistent with electrochemical deposition rather than mechanical application. The Departure Archive's maintenance specifications for the communication equipment preserved in the underground archive complexes describe what the text designates as devices that create the divine spark, a Sumerian compound that in the context of technical maintenance literature refers to the generation of electrical current rather than to fire. The Baghdad battery's configuration and voltage output correspond precisely to what the maintenance specifications describe as the activation power source for the crystalline focusing elements used in the departure route communication equipment. The Nimrud lens, recovered from the Assyrian palace complex at Nimrud by Austin Henry Layard in 1850, and currently housed in the British Museum as catalogue item ME 90959, is a plano-convex crystal disc approximately 11 centimeters in diameter and 4 millimeters thick that displays optical properties consistent with a deliberately manufactured lens, rather than a naturally occurring crystal formation. Analysis by optical physicist Giovanni Pettinato of the University of Rome La Sapienza demonstrated that the lens has a focal length of approximately 11 centimeters and an optical quality sufficient for magnification in close-range observation. The correspondence between the Nimrud lens's optical properties and the crystalline focusing elements described in the Ziggurat Observatory maintenance texts, where they are specified as being used for concentrating starlight toward the metallic resonance chambers, provides a physical exemplar for the optical technology the departure archive's monitoring infrastructure required. The accumulated evidence from the Antikythera mechanism, the Baghdad batteries, the Nimrud lens, and the precision-cut megalithic structures at sites from Puma Punku in Bolivia to the Osirian at Abydos in Egypt collectively represents a global inventory of technological artifacts that cannot be adequately explained as products of the civilizations in whose archaeological context they were found. They are more coherently understood as residual physical evidence of a technological tradition that the Departure Archive identifies as having been introduced to human civilization by the Anunnaki, and maintained by the bloodline guardian institutions across the periods of cyclical cultural disruption that intervened between its original introduction and the present day. The most recent and in many respects the most dramatic evidence for the continuation of this tradition's physical manifestations comes not from archaeological sites, but from declassified government censor records and sworn congressional testimony. The systematic declassification of government documents related to unidentified aerial phenomena that began in the United States with the release of Navy gun camera footage in 2017 and accelerated through congressional testimony in 2023 represents a genuine shift in the institutional position of the world's most technologically capable military organization toward a class of phenomena that the archaeological evidence examined throughout this investigation suggests is not new. The Nimitz carrier strike group encounter of November 2004, documented across multiple sensor platforms including the USS Princeton's SPY-1 radar system, the infrared cameras of 2 FA-18 Super Hornet aircraft, and the visual observations of multiple trained naval aviators, describes objects demonstrating flight characteristics, including instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic velocity without thermal signature, and transition between atmospheric and aquatic environments that correspond with remarkable specificity to descriptions of Anunnaki vessels found in the Cuneiform departure texts from Nippur and Babylon. The tablets designated in the Departure Archive series as describing the great vessels of return, including CBS 16042's reference to skycraft that move without the effort of wind or oar and produce brilliant illumination without fire, employ the same structural description pattern that naval aviator David Fravor used in his congressional testimony when describing the behavior of the object his aircraft encountered, an object that appeared to react to their presence with deliberate, controlled, apparently intelligent maneuvering. the behavioral characteristics distinguishing the Nimitz encounter object from any known human or natural aerial phenomenon are documented with unusual precision because of the multiple independent sensor platforms that simultaneously tracked the object. The USS Princeton's SPI-1 radar system had been tracking the Nimitz object for approximately 2 weeks before the visual encounter, logging a pattern of behavior that the Princeton's Senior Chief Petty Officer Kevin Day described in his detailed written account as defying all established physical models for aerial vehicles. The object descended from approximately 28,000 feet to sea level in less than 1 second on multiple occasions, a descent rate requiring acceleration values exceeding thousands of times Earth's gravitational constant, and that would destroy any known material structure under the resulting stress forces. The object then transitioned from aerial to aquatic environments without reducing speed, a transition that the Cuneiform Departure Archive describes, using the Sumerian compound for crossing the boundary between the upper waters and the lower waters, language that Mesopotamian scribes used specifically to designate the boundary between the atmospheric and hydrospheric domains of Enlil and Enki's respective territories. The congressional hearing conducted on the 26th of July 2023, during which former intelligence officer David Grush testified under oath before the House Oversight Committee's National Security Subcommittee, introduced a category of institutional acknowledgement extending beyond sensor data and visual observation to include testimony about physical materials recovered from non-human aerial vehicles. Grush's testimony, delivered under penalty of perjury and subsequently corroborated in specific technical details by former senior Navy pilot Ryan Graves and the retired commander of the Nimitz Carrier Strike Group, described a multi-decade program of retrieved vehicle analysis conducted within compartmentalized government programs. The specific material properties Grush described for the recovered objects, including mass ratios inconsistent with known materials and structural properties suggesting construction at the atomic or subatomic level, correspond to the Departure Archive's descriptions of the construction materials used for the great vessels of return, which tablet CBS 16042 describes as being fashioned from a material that is neither of the earth nor of the common metals, a description that in the context of Mesopotamian material classification systems refers to a substance outside all standard categories of earthly materials known to Babylonian metallurgy. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, established by the United States Department of Defense in 2022, charged with coordinating the collection, analysis, and reporting of unidentified aerial phenomena data across all military branches, represents the first officially acknowledged and institutionally structured government program for monitoring the class of phenomena the Departure Archive describes as characteristic of the pre-return monitoring period. The geographic distribution of UAP incidents, reported in the office's database, when mapped against the locations of ancient archaeological sites associated with Anunnaki presence, as documented in cuneiform sources, shows a non-random clustering pattern that aerospace engineers at the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies identified in their 2021 analysis as statistically significant at a confidence level exceeding 99%. The clustering is not explained by proximity to military installations or air traffic corridors. It corresponds to the geographic distribution of the Departure Archive's monitoring infrastructure sites, a correspondence that becomes interpretively significant when read alongside the systematic protocol convergence between modern SETI communication procedures and the ancient communication protocols that the Ziggurat operational texts document. The Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence program, established through Frank Drake's first systematic observation at Greenbank, West Virginia, in 1960, has operated for more than 6 decades on a set of foundational assumptions about how an advanced civilization might structure an outgoing communication signal to make it recognizable to a receiving civilization with no prior knowledge of the sender's technological capabilities. These assumptions, developed independently by astrophysicists working from first principles about information theory and signal detection, produce a remarkably specific set of recommendations for optimal signal structure, including the use of mathematical sequences to establish artificial origin, transmission in frequencies that minimize atmospheric and cosmic background interference, encoding in binary representation of universal physical constants, and timing transmissions to coincide with astronomically significant events that would alert a monitoring civilization to watch for signals. The Ziggurat Observatory operational text from the Departure Archive, specifically the procedures described in Tablet VAT 7851 for conducting communication attempts during what the text calls the time of the appointed paths, specify a communication protocol that follows the same logical structure with a precision that cannot be attributed to coincidence. The transmission procedures described in the Mesopotamian texts include mathematical sequencing to establish non-natural origin, frequency selection based on the resonance properties of the communication chambers, encoding in the base 60 numerical system that represents universal mathematical relationships, and strict timing requirements tied to the astronomical positions documented in the departure route records. The specific frequency selection logic that modern SETI engineers apply to their observation programs provides the clearest example of independent convergence on ancient communication protocol specifications. Frank Drake and his colleagues at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory selected the 1.42 GHz hydrogen emission line frequency for the Project Ozma observations in 1960 on the basis that hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, and that the electromagnetic emission frequency of hydrogen in its ground state transition represents a universal physical constant that any technologically capable civilization would necessarily know. The logic is compelling as an independently derived conclusion about optimal communication frequency. What makes it analytically significant in the context of the Departure Archive is that the Ziggurat communication chamber specifications in Tablet VAT 7851 describe frequency selection using an identical logical framework expressed in Sumerian technical vocabulary. The tablet specifies that the transmission frequency should correspond to the voice of the primary substance, a phrase that in Mesopotamian natural philosophy refers to the emission characteristic of the most fundamental, material constituent of the universe, the Sumerian equivalent of what modern physics designates as hydrogen in its ground state. The convergence between Drake's 1960 frequency selection rationale and the VAT 7851 specification for the same physical basis of frequency selection is not a near equivalence requiring interpretive latitude. It is an exact logical correspondence between two independently derived implementations of the same communication engineering principle. The Arecibo message, transmitted on the 16th of November 1974 from the Arecibo radio telescope in Puerto Rico toward the globular star cluster Messier 13, encoded binary representations of the numbers 1 through 10, the atomic numbers of the elements comprising human DNA, the molecular formula of the DNA double helix, a graphic representation of a human being with physical dimensions specified in binary notation, and a diagram of the Arecibo telescope itself. The encoding scheme used binary representation of mathematical quantities as the message's structural foundation, a design choice that Frank Drake, Carl Sagan, and their collaborators at Cornell University made on the basis that binary representation of integers is the simplest possible encoding system available to any technologically capable civilization and would therefore be recognizable as an artificial signal by any receiver capable of detecting it. The VAT 7851 tablet's description of the encoding method used in the Departure Archive's communication attempts specifies a system of counting notches placed in alternating arrangements, a description that, when translated from its Sumerian technical vocabulary, corresponds to binary encoding of numerical sequences, the same encoding choice that Sagan and Drake independently derived as optimal for cross-civilization communication more than 3,000 years later. The WOW signal, detected by astronomer Jerry Eman at the Big Ear Radio Telescope of Ohio State University on the 15th of August 1977, remains the most compelling candidate for an extraterrestrial artificial signal yet recorded in the 6 decades of systematic ST observation. The signal lasted 72 seconds, the maximum duration possible given Earth's rotation relative to the telescope's fixed pointing direction, displayed a frequency of 1.42 GHz, corresponding exactly to the hydrogen emission line, and showed a signal strength approximately 30 times greater than the background noise level. The signal originated from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius, a region that falls within the Mullepin Catalogue's path of Enlil, the northern boundary stellar zone that the Departure Archive designates as the primary departure route for senior Anunnaki figures. No subsequent monitoring of the same sky region has reproduced the signal, consistent with the Departure Archive's description of communication transmissions as timed to specific astronomical window conditions rather than continuous broadcasts. The correspondence between the WOW signal's characteristics and the Departure Archive's communication specifications suggests that 1977 may have provided the first modern physical detection of a transmission conforming to the protocol that ancient Mesopotamian priests had maintained their ziggurat monitoring systems to receive across 40 centuries of operational continuity, the mathematical systems that those same priests maintained as the chronological framework for predicting when such transmissions would intensify, are now converging from multiple independent traditions on the current historical period with a precision that their designers appear to have intended. The mathematical independence of the world's major ancient prophetic chronological systems makes their convergence toward the current historical period a datum that demands analytical attention rather than dismissal. The Mayan long count calendar, developed in isolation from Old World astronomical traditions, tracks a great cycle totaling 5,125 solar years, a period that the Dresden Codex mathematical tables demonstrate was calculated using astronomical observation records spanning multiple centuries. The end date of the most recent long count cycle, the 13th Bacton completion in December 2012, does not describe the end of the world in indigenous Mayan sources. It describes the end of the current age and the beginning of a transition period of unspecified duration in which the conditions established in the previous age are replaced by those of the next. The Hindu Kali Yuga dating system, calculated from the start date of 3102 BC using the astronomical alignment described in the Mahabharata, places the current era approximately 5,125 years into the Kali Yuga's 432,000-year duration. When the Kali Yuga subcycle calculations described in the Vishnu Purana are applied, they identify the current century as the period of maximum darkness and maximum crisis that immediately precedes the transition to the next age, what the texts call the arrival of Kalki, the 10th avatar of Vishnu, whose characteristics in the Kalki Purana match with notable specificity the profile of returning advanced beings capable of technological intervention in human civilization. The Kalki Purana's description of the arriving avatar provides the most technically detailed account of what the next phase of divine intervention will involve. The text describes Kalki as accompanied by assistants whose organizational structure matches the Anunnaki administrative hierarchy documented in the Departure Archive, with senior figures corresponding to the primary Anunnaki leaders and junior attendants corresponding to the Apkallu sages who served as their earthly intermediaries. More significantly, the Kalki Purana specifies the geographic locations where the avatar will first establish contact with human civilization, naming specific regions that correspond to the locations of ancient Anunnaki administrative sites documented in the Departure Archive's territorial distribution records. The convergence between the expected arrival geography in the Kalki Purana and the pre-departure Anunnaki territorial distribution in cuneiform sources is not the result of the Hindu tradition borrowing from Mesopotamian sources through any documented cultural transmission pathway. It represents independent preservation of the same territorial information within different branches of the Bloodline Guardian institutional network. The Hopi prophecy concerning the return of the Pahana, the true white brother separated from his people at the beginning of the current world, specifies both behavioral characteristics and technological capabilities of the returning figure that correspond to the CBS 10673 return specification. The Pahana is described as arriving carrying the missing piece of a sacred tablet whose other portion the Hopi have preserved across generations of careful custodianship. This physical joining of separated documents corresponds precisely to the Departure Archive's description of the verification protocol through which the returning Anunnaki would establish their identity to the human bloodline guardians, with the returning party presenting the original departure documentation whose countercopy the guardians had retained as a verification key. The Zoroastrian prophecy of the Frashokereti, the final renovation of the universe concluding the current cosmic cycle, describes the arrival of the Saoshyant, a divine savior figure who will lead humanity through a period of purification and restoration before the establishment of a new cosmic order. Zoroastrian calendrical calculations in the Bunda Hishin identify the Frashokereti as occurring at the end of the current 12,000-year cosmic age, specifically at the culmination of the fourth 3,000-year period that corresponds in the Departure Archive's scheduling framework to the current SAR cycle's terminal phase. The mathematical precision of this timeline places the Frashokereti within a window of approximately 1 to 2 centuries from the present, aligning with the Departure Archive's pre-primary window calculation that estimates primary indicator activation within 30 to 90 years of the secondary indicators reaching saturation. The convergence of the Mayan long count cycle completion, the Kali Yuga subcycle maximum crisis period, the Hopi Pahana and Blue Star prophecies, and the Zoroastrian Frashokereti timeline on the current historical period is not the result of selective reading of prophecy to find modern relevance. It is the product of independent mathematical systems, each derived from distinct astronomical and cultural traditions, that arrive at the same chronological window through the same underlying SAR-based framework that the CBS 10673 tablet series preserves in its most technically documented form. What those converging timelines point toward is a moment whose nature the departure archive itself characterizes with a specificity that no other prophetic tradition quite matches. The CBS 10673 tablet series, taken as a complete prophetic document rather than a collection of fragments, does not describe the Anunnaki return as a rescue operation for a civilization in distress. The language of the departure archive is consistently the language of scheduled intervention in a developmental process, the terminology of an educational program reaching a critical transition point rather than the terminology of emergency response. The distinction matters because it shapes the interpretive framework through which the evidence examined throughout this investigation can be understood. The Sumerian administrative text known as Tablet N456, part of the Nippur archive deposit, describes the purpose of the return using a compound expression that translates most accurately as the completion of the appointed shaping, a phrase that belongs to the vocabulary of Mesopotamian craft production, specifically to the description of a manufacturing process that reaches the stage at which raw material has been sufficiently worked to receive its final intended form. Human civilization, in this framework, is not a population to be rescued, but a project approaching the developmental threshold at which the next phase of intentional shaping becomes possible. The 7 signs are not warnings that humanity is failing. They are indicators that humanity has reached, through the specific combination of technological achievement and crisis that the departure framework predicted, the precise condition for which the Anunnaki return was originally designed. The Mesopotamian craft vocabulary, from which the phrase completion of the appointed shaping derives, provides a surprisingly specific description of what the next phase involves at the operational level. In Sumerian administrative texts describing craft production, the appointed shaping refers to the sequence of interventions that a master craftsman performs on raw material to bring it progressively closer to its intended final form. The process does not end when the material first acquires the shape of the intended object. It ends when the material has been worked to the point where it can receive the final surface treatment, the polishing, tempering, or inscription that converts a shaped object into a functional one. The departure archive's use of this craft vocabulary to describe the return's purpose positions the current state of human civilization not as a failed project requiring rescue, but as a shaped but unfinished object that has reached the stage at which the final intended treatment can be applied. The specific final treatments described in the Departure Archive's Return Protocol section correspond to 3 domains that the text designates as the 3 gifts of return. The first gift is described using the Sumerian compound for direct knowledge transmission, the process through which the Apkallu sages initially provided human civilization with the foundational knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and governance. The text specifies that the first gift of return will involve transmission of the complete knowledge that has accumulated in the Anunnaki's home domain during the withdrawal period, a body of knowledge that the tablet describes as exceeding by many times the knowledge transmitted at the original establishment of civilization. The second gift is described using vocabulary for what Mesopotamian administrative texts call the restoration of the original form, a process of correcting accumulated deviations from an original specification to return a system to its designed operating parameters. Applied to human civilization, this corresponds to intervention in the crisis conditions that the 7 signs identify, specifically the environmental degradation and the illegitimate governance structure that the 5th and 7th signs document as having exceeded their threshold values. The third gift is described using vocabulary for enhancement, the deliberate improvement of a system's capabilities beyond its original design specifications, a final gift that the tablet positions as the culmination of the return rather than its beginning, corresponding to the transition that cross-cultural prophetic traditions describe as the arrival of a new world age characterized by capabilities and states of consciousness unavailable during the current cycle. The evidence assembled throughout this investigation, from the cuneiform tablets of Nippur to the submerged urban ruins of the Persian Gulf, from the differential gears of the Antikythera mechanism to the genetic clustering of longevity variants in populations near ancient Anunnaki sites, from the acoustic resonance of ziggurat chambers to the structural correspondence between SETI protocols and Babylonian communication procedures, collectively points toward a conclusion that the Departure Archive's own framing of the seven signs makes explicit. We are not a civilization approaching collapse. We are a project approaching completion. The crisis conditions that the 5 currently active or approaching signs document are not evidence of our failure. They are the specific combination of technological achievement and environmental and institutional stress that the Departure Archive identified 4,000 years ago as the necessary and sufficient conditions for initiating the return. The bloodline guardian institutions, the mystery school curricula, the underground archives, and the ziggurat monitoring systems were not built to prevent this moment. They were built to ensure that when this moment arrived, the knowledge accumulated across the withdrawal period would be intact, the communication channels would be operational, and the human institutions capable of facilitating the transition would still exist. Whether those institutions have in fact survived in functional form, and whether the monitoring systems they were designed to maintain are still capable of detecting the primary indicator signs as they approach their threshold values, is the question that the evidence examined in this investigation leaves most urgently open. The answer may depend in large part on how seriously contemporary civilization is prepared to engage with the possibility that the tablets recovered from a sealed chamber beneath the ruins of Nippur in the 19th century contain not mythology, but operational records whose scheduled activation date approaches within the lifespan of the current generation. The evidence assembled across this investigation does not support a minor revision of conventional history. It supports its fundamental reinterpretation. The CBS 10673 Departure Archive, the underground archive complexes at Nippur, Eridu, and Babylon, the ziggurat observatory networks with their acoustic resonance chambers and precision metallurgical equipment, the bloodline guardian lineages documented in Sumerian administrative records, and the cross-cultural mathematical encoding of the SAR unit across Hindu, Norse, Zoroastrian, Egyptian, and Mesoamerican cosmological traditions are not independent expressions of universal human mythology. They are components of a coordinated preservation and monitoring system built to last across multiple SAR cycles and to activate upon recognition of the specific threshold conditions enumerated in the 7 signs. We are not the first advanced civilization to emerge on Earth. The evidence from submerged sites in the Persian Gulf, from the precision-cut megalithic structures at Pumapunku and the Osirian at Abydos, from the astronomical calculations embedded in the Mul-Dapin coordinate system and preserved intact across 7,000 years of scribal tradition, demonstrates that the civilization whose operational records the CBS 10673 tablets preserve was itself built upon the foundations of something older still. What distinguished its departure from the collapses of previous cycles is that it was planned. The knowledge was archived, the bloodlines were selected, the monitoring systems were commissioned, and the threshold conditions for return were documented with the specificity of an engineering specification rather than the ambiguity of religious prophecy. 3 of those threshold conditions are currently active. 2 others are approaching their documented trigger values. The mathematical framework that the Departure Archive uses to locate the return window within the 3,600-year SR cycle, cross-referenced against the independently derived chronological convergence of the Kali Yuga subcycle maximum, the Mayan long count transition period, and the Zoroastrian Frashokereti timeline, places the pre-primary indicator window within the current century. This is not a conclusion that the evidence demands we accept on faith. It is a conclusion that follows from applying the Departure Archive's own diagnostic criteria to objectively measurable current conditions, and from taking the mathematical precision of those criteria at face value, rather than softening it through the theological interpretation that conventional scholarship has traditionally applied. The significance for contemporary humanity is neither comforting nor alarming in the way that apocalyptic frameworks typically are. The Departure Archive does not describe what is approaching as the end. It describes it as the completion of the appointed shaping, the moment at which 4,000 years of managed developmental process reached the threshold at which the final intended treatment can be applied. What that treatment consists of, the 3 gifts of return that the CBS 10673 tablets enumerate as direct knowledge transmission, restoration of original operating parameters, and enhancement beyond original design specifications, represents not a rescue, but a graduation. The transition from a managed developmental phase to a stage of existence that the Departure Archive scribes, working in the ruins of a civilization they did not fully understand themselves, could only gesture toward using the most precise vocabulary available to them. The choice before the current generation is not whether to believe the tablets, it is whether to engage with the evidence seriously enough to understand what they say is coming, and to participate consciously in the transition they describe as having been designed from the very beginning, specifically for this moment.